Foundations, what AI is and isn't, computation, intelligence, and the mind if we were to tell a story about artificial intelligence. We would begin with questions that sound simple on the surface and become surprisingly stubborn the moment we try to answer them in full. What counts as AI? How does computation relate to mind, to thought? To understanding, and beyond that, what is the difference between intelligence and consciousness, between symbol handling and genuine comprehension? In this exploration, we trace a path from the early bold bets of Turing's generation to the intricate debates that shape how we understand machines today. We will not merely tally milestones, we will follow the undercurrents of ideas, the assumptions, the counterarguments, the shifting sands of what counts as a mind and what counts as a machine. Let us start with the most elemental question. The question that has haunted philosophers since the dawn of formal reasoning: what counts as AI? Some days the term feels almost unproblematic. If a program can beat a grandmaster, converse with convincing fluency, or navigate a complex environment with marked autonomy, surely we have something that deserves the label. Other days, the same term seems a misnomer, a label we apply to clever tool-making rather than to genuine minds. Between those poles lie concerns about whether AI merely simulates intelligence, whether computation is truly a model of the mind, and whether there is any useful distinction left between intelligence and consciousness. The distinction between symbol processing and understanding has haunted debates almost from the moment computers entered laboratories, libraries, and clinics. Is a system that manipulates symbols according to rules really thinking in any meaningful sense? Or is it merely performing a sophisticated choreography of syntax without semantic significance? Consider computation itself as a lens. If mind is a product of information processing, then perhaps a suitably organized machine, designed to manipulate representations, to apply rules, to learn from data, could realize intellect that rivals or even exceeds our own. If, on the other hand, mind rests on something beyond symbols, the qualitative immediacy of experience, the felt unity of subjectivity, then computation might remain powerful and useful, but not in the strict sense. A mind in the human sense. The tension between those options has animated discussions about symbol manipulation, levels of analysis, and the ongoing quarrel between symbolic AI and connectionist approaches. It has driven a century of attempts to capture intelligence in machines, and it continues to shape contemporary debates about the limits, promise, and meaning of artificial minds. To speak of foundations is to speak of a history as well as a set of claims. The arc from Alan Turing to the present is not simply a line of technical milestones, it is a history of how thinkers have framed the core problem. What counts as evidence for intelligence, and what the boundaries of mind and machine should look like. Let us begin with Turing, whose spark of audacity lit a path that many would follow, for better and worse. Across decades of hopeful prognostication and stubborn critique, Alan Turing and the Imitation Game, Courage and a Question in 1950. The young mathematician and codebreaker wrote a short paper that would become one of the most influential in the philosophy of mind and the science of AI. He asks a provocative, almost clarifying question: can machines think? The wording might seem quaint or even indulgent in retrospect, but it is the right question to ask when you want to probe what minds do and what machines might do in similar spaces. Turing does not pretend to offer a final definition of thought. Instead, he reframes the problem as one that can be studied empirically by observing behavior under constraints. He proposes a simple, striking experimental scenario, the imitation game, the forerunner of what we now call the Turing test. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? He does not pretend to settle the metaphysics. He offers a practical, testable route. In the imitation game, a human judge interacts with a human and with a machine, both of whom are hidden from view. The judge asks questions and receives answers. If the machine's responses are indistinguishable from the human's, Turing argues, the machine should be regarded as intelligent in the relevant sense. He emphasizes that the test centers on behavior, not on ontology. If the machine acts as if it were thinking and can do so well enough to deceive the judge, then we have good grounds to treat that performance as evidence of intelligence. The beauty and the burden of Turing's proposal is that it sidesteps a stubborn problem. What exactly is thought? He does not pretend to define it once and for all. He offers a criterion that is, in effect, public and behavioral. The imitation game shifts the debate from the private theater of inner experiences to the social theater of interaction. The mind, in this view, can be given a public-facing test. The line that has become famous from the era is a simple, unapologetic invitation. I propose to consider the question: Can machines think? And he frames the larger ambition as a matter of a long experimental program, not a momentary verdict. 2 decades later, the Dartmouth Conference of 1956 would crystallize a more ambitious mood, that minds might, in principle, be emulated in machines, and that the problem could be tackled through a concerted alliance of mathematics, psychology, logic, computer science, and cognitive speculation. The conference is enshrined in lore as the birth of AI as a field, though over time, the optimism would wax and wane with the tides of research and funding. The Dartmouth gathering did not merely gather experts, it framed a project as a grand enterprise, to construct machines capable of simulating the processes that produce human intelligence. The moment feels almost ceremonial, a coming together of minds to declare a path forward. To imagine a future where silicon can mimic the workings of the human mind. The early demonstrations that followed, Logic Theorist 1956 and ELIZA 1966, are not ancillary footnotes but central chapters in the story. Logic Theorist, created by Alan Newell and Herbert A. Simon, began as a program designed to prove relationships among logical theorems. It appeared to solve problems that many human logicians deemed non-trivial, a suggestion that a machine could, at least in narrow domains, carry out tasks with a kind of reasoned elegance. It was not a universal thinker, it was a symbol-manipulating prodigy, yet its success offered a different kind of promise, that the right bundle of rules, the right formal representations could yield surprising, even human-like feats of deduction. The moment resonated as a proof of concept that intelligence could, at least in part, be captured as computation. ELIZA, conceived by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT a few years later, is a different creature, a demonstration that language and social interaction could be simulated with astonishingly modest machinery. ELIZA was a pattern-matching program that could parry a user's statements with canned responses, sometimes giving the impression that a responsive, even empathic, presence stood behind the interface. The program did not understand the words it processed in any human sense. It did not know what I claimed to feel, nor did it recognize the real content of the user's message. Yet, as users constructed their own narratives during the conversations, a sense of human-like participation could arise in them. The ELIZA story raises a set of crucial questions. If a machine can imitate conversation well enough to appear to understand, does that constitute genuine understanding? And if not, what exactly are we missing when we overlay human attributes onto machines that merely simulate them? The questions did not disappear as the field grew, for many. The early triumphs confirmed a conviction: computation, the symbolic manipulation of information, could replicate aspects of intelligence. For others, these demonstrations revealed a vulnerability. Impressive surface behavior can obscure a lack of understanding, a failure of intentional states, or a gap between function and phenomenology. The ensuing debate would push thinkers toward deeper questions about levels of analysis, about what counts as a mind, and about whether the mind can be demystified by algorithms and rules alone. Symbolic AI, Mars levels. And the tension with connectionism, a central thread in the story, is the distinction between symbol processing and those other ways of thinking about intelligence. The symbolic tradition treats cognition as the manipulation of abstract symbols according to formal rules. The hope is that with the right symbolic machinery, logic, search strategies, representations, the mind could be modeled as a sophisticated information processing system. The symbols are not mere tokens, they encode structure, meaning, even goals. The reason to pursue this path is not only technical success, it is the promise of explainability and modular design. If we know the rules and the representations, we can trace how a system reasons, modify its steps, and understand its failures in principled ways. David Marr offered a powerful heuristic for thinking about complex information processing systems. He proposed that we analyze intelligent systems at 3 distinct levels: the computational level, the algorithmic level, and the implementational level. The computational level asks what problem the system is solving, the abstract goal, the function it performs. The algorithmic level asks how the system accomplishes the task, the representations it uses, the steps it takes, the processes it implements. The implementational level asks what hardware or physical substrate carries out these processes: neurons, silicon circuits, memory architectures. Marr's insight is that understanding one level in isolation often leaves crucial questions unanswered. Only by coordinating all 3 levels can we understand a system's capabilities and limits. In the symbolic AI story, the computational level is explicit. The problem space is defined in terms of search over symbols, rules for manipulating those symbols, and goals to be achieved through a sequence of inferences. The algorithmic level then asks, what representations will capture the problem domain, and what procedures will manipulate those representations efficiently? The implementational level asks how a computer, with its circuits and software, will realize the algorithm. The dream behind symbolic AI and the rationale for the Dartmouth optimism was that many cognitive tasks, planning, theorem-proving, problem-solving, symbolic reasoning could be captured with a finite set of rules operating on structured representations. Yet a countercurrent rose against this confident claim, and it is a countercurrent that still courses through contemporary AI. On the symbolic side, thinkers like John Searle, Hubert Dreyfus, Hilary, Putnam, Jerry Fodor, and in different ways. David Marr himself became skeptical about the sufficiency of symbolic processing for genuine intelligence and understanding. Searle's Chinese Room argument is the most famous articulation of a challenge. Even if a machine could pass the imitation game by manipulating symbols with perfect fidelity, would that entail that the machine understands what it is saying? If the mind's content requires something beyond mere syntax, some form of semantic grasp, something like intentionality, then symbol manipulation alone may be unable to deliver mind in the fullest sense. Searle did not deny that symbol manipulation can produce intelligent behavior. He did deny that symbolic prowess by itself is tantamount to mind. He posed a challenge that is as much philosophical as technological. Can the mind arise from the right kind of computation? Or does it require something more, something anchored in conscious experience? The heart of his argument rests on a distinction between the appearance of understanding and genuine understanding. A program could be bright, could answer questions, could perform tasks with remarkable accuracy, and yet Searle would ask us to attend to what is missing, the inner grasp, the first-person perspective that makes thoughts feel like thoughts. Not just outputs, the critique did not end with Searle's paper. It rippled through the field and produced a set of replies that attempted to salvage the dream of machine understanding. The system's reply, for example, contends that while the individual running the program might not understand Chinese, the entire system, the man who follows the instructions, the book of rules, the program's data structures, and the hardware that executes them, does understand. The robot reply expands the thought further. If the system could interact with the world through a body, if it could perceive, act, and continually integrate experiences, then perhaps understanding could emerge as a property of embodied interaction with things rather than as a purely mental state isolated in a head or a machine's software. These replies aim to show that the era of explanation should move away from the person embedded in the head to the system as a whole. In its environment, whether the replies are ultimately successful, they force the conversation to become more nuanced. An AI can display mastery in language, perception, and planning. But the question remains whether that mastery suffices for genuine understanding. Hilary, Putnam, Jerry Fodor. And the mind as computation. Think of Hilary Putnam's functionalist turn as a milestone that shaped much of the contemporary philosophy of mind. Functionalism takes the view that mental states are defined not by their internal material constitution, but by their causal roles, by how they function within a larger system. In its most ambitious form, functionalism invites the mind to be realized in multiple substrates. A brain might realize mental states, but so might a computer with the right functional architecture. The mind becomes, in a sense, what the mind does, not what it is made of. Putnam's early exchanges with functionalist ideas helped lay groundwork for the claim that mental states could be multiply realizable. If a silicon device could reliably implement the same causal roles as neural states for perception, belief, desire, and intention, then perhaps the mind is less about biology and more about organization. Jerry Fodor enters the scene with a different but related conviction. In the mind does not work like a computer, as a common shorthand for the debate. Fodor argued in his own influential terms that cognitive architecture is modular, structured, and that the mind processes information in ways that cannot be reduced to a single global computation. He defended a computational theory of mind, but with caveats. Cognition is modularized, content is represented in a structured way, and the system's inner architecture matters for what can be learned and how it can be generalized. The mind, in Fodor's account, is a sophisticated factory of representations and rules. But not every black box computation counts as thinking in a robust, human-like sense. The debate between functionalist intuitions that mind can be realized across substrates and the insistence on specific Structured architectures helps explain why AI research has split over the decades into different currents and why the question, what does it take to think, remains contentious. David Marr, meanwhile, provides a methodological clarity that still resonates in discussions of AI and cognitive science. The three levels of analysis, the computational level, the algorithmic level, and the implementational level, offer a lens to understand what a system does, how it does it, and with what physical material it is realized. Marr did not deny the value of deeper philosophical questions, but he insisted that progress requires consistent anchoring across these levels. The computational level asks about the problem being solved. Why is a given task the task at hand? The algorithmic level asks about representations and procedures, what data structures, what transformations, what learning rules. The implementational level asks about physics, are neurons silicon circuits, or perhaps exotic substrates carrying out the computation. The historical resonance is clear, as symbolic AI pursued rule-based systems. Marr's levels reminded researchers that success in a lab or a chessboard is not the same as understanding the phenomena at stake in human cognition. The mind, in this sense, is a problem of design at multiple scales, and progress requires a theory that accounts for all three. The tension between symbolic AI and connectionism, the birth of a second wind as the story unfolds. A second major movement begins to challenge the dominance of hand-coded rules, connectionism, which studies cognition as emergent from networks of simple units that learn from data. The earlier flirtation with neural networks, early perceptron models, gave way to more robust, scalable architectures and learning algorithms in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The shift was not only technical, it signaled a philosophical inflection. Perhaps intelligence does not live primarily in the elegance of symbolic derivation, but arises from patterns of distributed representation, from learning to approximate functions that map inputs to outputs, from networks that adapt to experience. To the symbolic camp, the rise of connectionist ideas was a threat to the dream of a fully interpretable, rule-governed mind. To the connectionist camp, the symbolic dream had produced impressive results but left crucial gaps. How do you capture high-level abstractions, compositionality, and systematic generalization in a domain that learns from data without explicit structure? The debate, often caricatured as symbolic AI versus neural nets, became, in part, a debate about the nature of mind itself. Is cognition a manipulation of symbolic representations with clear rules, or is it the outcome of distributed learned patterns that do not map cleanly onto explicit rules? In time, both sides learned from one another. The field did not collapse into a single orthodoxy. Instead, it broadened into a spectrum where symbolic methods are deployed alongside learning-based methods, and where hybrid architectures attempt to combine the interpretability of symbols with the adaptability of neural networks. The modern landscape is filled with systems that use probabilistic reasoning over symbolic representations, neural symbolic hybrids, and deep learning models that achieve astonishing feats in perception, planning, and strategy games. The tension remains a living strand in foundational discussions. Can we ever fully capture intelligence by computing, or does the machine need to have a body and a history, a life in the world that shapes its learning and its meaning? Two counterarguments you will often hear. First, the strong AI thesis versus a weak AI baseline. The strong AI thesis holds that a machine, if appropriately programmed, truly has a mind, consciousness, and understanding, that it can literally think, not merely simulate thinking. The weak AI position, by contrast, claims that AI is valuable precisely because it simulates aspects of intelligence for practical ends, to diagnose, to translate, to assist, to anticipate, without claiming that the machine has mental states, feelings, or true understanding. Proponents of strong AI argue that if a system's cognitive processes are functionally indistinguishable from those of a human, then we should treat it as intelligent in the full sense. Critics, including Searle and many others, respond by insisting that functional indistinguishability does not guarantee phenomenal or semantic properties. The question persists: can a system that passes a battery of tests in no way possess the subjective character of thought? Second, Searle's Chinese Room and its replies. Searle's central intuition is stark: syntax without semantics cannot yield understanding. If you feed a person who does not know Chinese a set of rules and a book of Chinese characters and have them produce correct outputs, the person is not understanding the language. The machine, likewise, could be a perfect symbol manipulator that never grasps the content. The difficulty for the counterargument is that language understanding could be a property of the system as a whole. The system's reply argues that the entire system, processor, program and the data understands, even if no single part has the understanding. The robot reply pushes this further. If the system were embodied, interacting with the world and using perception to ground symbols, then perhaps it would develop genuine understanding as a cognitive asset that emerges from situated action. These replies are not conclusory vindications. They are prompts to reframe what counts as understanding, how it arises, and what the proper endpoints of explanation should be. In this landscape, the strong/weak AI debate remains a persistent hinge. Is intelligence merely a matter of behavior and function? Or does it demand something more about the interior life of the system? The strong AI claim, in its most ambitious versions, suggests that by suitably programming and arranging a machine, we can instantiate mind, subjectivity, and conscious awareness. The weak AI claim suggests a pragmatic approach. We care about the system's abilities to reason, to learn, to produce results, to integrate with human practices, regardless of whether the machine has a mind in the fullest sense. The debate is not merely about semantics. It concerns what we owe to the machines we create, how we should measure success, how we should interpret our own cognitive life in light of non-human intelligences, and how to navigate responsibilities in a world where systems can learn to perform complex tasks on their own. Concrete milestones and what they teach us about intelligence if the questions above are the philosophical scaffolding. The demonstrations in fieldwork and lab are the practical pillars. The logic theorists showed that a computer could, with human guidance, begin to reason about proving theorems. It offered a blueprint for how symbolic reasoning could be formalized, turned into search problems, and implemented in software. It is tempting to view this as a triumph of human-style reasoning reproduced by machine. Yet the broader picture is more subtle. The task was narrow, the domain tightly specified, and the performance hinged on the careful crafting of representations and rules by human designers. Eliza's breakthrough was different, yet equally instructive. The program could produce responses that felt responsive, even intimate. Within a conversational frame, the user might leave a chat with the impression that a mind was listening to them, that someone understood. Weizenbaum's reflection on Eliza points to a crucial ethical and epistemic question. How do we respond to machines that evoke human-like engagement? If a user forms a social bond with a machine, does this tell us something about the social nature of intelligence, or about the human need to invest meaning in interacting partners? Eliza thus functions as a mirror for our own cognitive and affective life. It is also a reminder that surface-level competence, cleverness at a given task, does not guarantee a full understanding of what those tasks imply for living. Feeling beings, as the field advanced, the bar inevitably rose. A modern chess engine, and later Deep Blue's 1997 victory over Garry Kasparov, dramatized a different kind of capability, not neural networks that learned by backpropagation alone, but systems that combined search, evaluation functions, and careful domain knowledge to conquer a terrifically challenging problem. In chess, Deep Blue did not just compute, it exploited a broad, strategic sense of the game, guided by an architecture that valued speed, precision, and breadth of search. The victory upped a long-standing debate about whether symbolic AI could ever reach human-level or superhuman capabilities in complex domains. The machine's success in a purely rule-governed domain suggested that a certain kind of intelligence is, at least in part, a matter of computational power, representation, and algorithmic organization. Since then, modern milestones have proliferated: sophisticated chess engines, multi-agent planning systems, and increasingly capable reinforcement learning models that can master games, robotics tasks, logistics, and even some aspects of natural language understanding. Yet for every breakthrough, critics remind us that performance in a restricted task is not, by itself, evidence of general intelligence. The world is messy, the problems are open-ended, and the human mind remains a multifaceted phenomenon. The question becomes less about whether a machine can beat us at a game, and more about what the game reveals about intelligence itself. How we build systems that cooperate with people, and what responsibilities we bear when we deploy AI in medicine, law, education, and governance. The role of sources and influences in the long arc. If you track how the field has evolved, you will see cross-referencing among many thinkers whose ideas illuminate different aspects of the same problem. Turing's work anchors the practical, testable approach to intelligence, behavior in context, criteria for success, and the possibility that machines could become indistinguishable from humans in response to questions posed by human judges. the mind-body problem. The questions about whether mental states are reducible to physical states or whether they stand as distinct kinds of properties returns again and again in the background of discussions about AI. The philosophy of mind, functionalism, behaviorism, physicalism, and the debates about consciousness provides a map of interpretive routes that AI researchers can travel or avoid, depending on their theoretical commitments. The cognitive science revolution brought to life by Fodor, and a generation of researchers, continues to be a source of both inspiration and critique. Mar's three levels invite us to examine not only what a system does, but why and how it does it. And with what materials, the algorithmic questions, how to represent, how to learn, how to generalize, link directly to questions about embodiment and situated cognition that Dreyfus would emphasize in his critique of the AI dream. Dreyfus argued that tacit knowledge and embodied know-how underlie human intelligence in ways that are difficult to capture in formal rule-based systems. The embodied turn in cognitive science and the emergent properties of neural networks intersect with his critique. Perhaps intelligence is inseparable from life in a world. From sensory-motor coupling, from improvisation and adaptation in real time. Hilary Putnam's functionalist perspective, for its part, invites a broader sense of what counts as realizing the mind. The mind could be realized in silicon, in a robot, or in a brain-scanning apparatus that simulates mental processes. The crucial caveat is that functional identity does not guarantee phenomenal, experiential states. Fodor's modular theory, with its insistence on structured representations and domain-specific processes, offers a counterweight to overly liberal claims about the mind as a single universal computer. And Jerry Fodor's insistence on the systematic structure of cognitive architecture remains a touchstone for debates about how even advanced AI systems can generalize in principled ways across tasks that share no direct surface similarity. Anecdotes that ground these debates in lived history, the story is not only a set of abstract claims, it is also a tapestry of moments that reveal how people responded to new machinery, how institutions shaped research directions, and how public perception shifted with each milestone. One such anecdote centers on Turing's own 1950 assertion of the imitation game. He was not merely predicting a future, he was declaring a method of inquiry that would invite society to judge machines not by their inner states but by their outward performances. The imitation game was, in a way, a social experiment embedded in a technical proposal. It asked, in a direct, almost pragmatic way, what counts as thinking when the most visible criterion for thinking is convincing conversational behavior? The anecdote reveals an essential aspect of the enterprise. To judge AI, we must decide what test will be credible to both scientists and laypeople, and how to interpret success in a world where appearances matter as much as capabilities. Another anecdote centers on the Dartmouth Conference. Held in 1956, the event gathered luminaries with diverse backgrounds, all sharing the hope that a new field could illuminate the nature of intelligence in machines. The meeting signaled a collective optimism about the possibility of building systems that could simulate or replicate core cognitive faculties. It was a moment of social and intellectual communion. But it also foreshadowed the long, oscillating arc of AI. The early optimism would be tempered by the practical challenges of building general-purpose intelligence, then revived by new data and architectures decades later. The Dartmouth moment is a reminder that big theoretical bets often ride on the shoulders of a shared enthusiasm among researchers and institutions that fund them. If we pivot to the mid-century critique, the Lighthill Report of 1973 marked a dramatic inflection point, commissioned by the British government. The report cast a skeptical eye on the claims of AI's rapid progress and argued that the field had overpromised and underdelivered in specific domains. The Lighthill Report became a touchstone for the AI winter, a period when funding dried up and researchers retrenched. The historical anecdote is not simply a cautionary tale about hype. It is a reminder that scientific communities move with their own pressures, that policy and funding shapes the pace of discovery, and that a field's identity evolves through both successes and public scrutiny. Weizenbaum's ELIZA brings another layer to the story. ELIZA showed with unsettling clarity how human-like conversation can arise from pattern matching and surface-level coherence. Weizenbaum warned that the appearance of understanding could mislead people into attributing genuine human qualities to machines. The ELIZA anecdote is a cautionary tale about human-computer interaction. Even modestly capable systems can alter social expectations, arouse emotional responses, and tempt people to respond to strings of text as if they are in the presence of a conscious agent. The human tendency to anthropomorphize technology becomes, in this telling, a critical ethical and epistemic test for researchers, designers, and policymakers. Cross-references and deeper connections to deepen the story. We cross-reference with related strands of thought. The philosophy of mind's debate about functionalism versus physicalism and the possibility of multiple realizability looms large. If a mental state could be realized in different physical substrates, AI research might not be constrained by biology, but could still capture the functional essence of thought. The mind-body problem persists as background music to the conversation. Can the mind be fully captured by computation? Or is there something in the subjective, phenomenological life that resists such reduction? The cognitive science tradition invites us to consider representation, causation, and learning. The debates between symbolic AI and connectionism are not merely technical. They concern how we model cognition, how we explain intelligence, and how to design systems that learn in real-world environments. The historical anecdotes and the cross-references converge on a common lesson. The project of AI is as much about epistemology and value as it is about engineering. When we talk about intelligence, we talk about what it takes to predict, to reason under uncertainty, to learn from experience, to adapt across contexts, to act in concert with humans, and to reflect on what those capacities reveal about ourselves. A good segment of the field is devoted to questions about interpretation, explanation, and responsibility. How do we ensure that AI systems are reliable, fair, and safe? How do we balance the benefits of automated decision-making with the need for human oversight, accountability, and transparency? These are not secondary concerns. They are central to the foundations of AI as a discipline that touches almost every domain of public life. Worlds of application and modern interpretation. The historical arc would be incomplete without looking at real-world applications that have affected everyday life. AI today is not an abstract curiosity. It underpins medical diagnostics, personalized education, predictive maintenance, and autonomous navigation. In medicine, AI systems can assist in diagnosing diseases, interpreting imaging data, and suggesting treatment plans. In education, adaptive systems tailor content to learners' needs, while in industry and logistics, AI optimizes supply chains and schedules. In transportation, autonomous vehicles promise to reshape mobility, reduce accidents, and reconfigure urban design. In many of these contexts, the questions about symbol manipulation and understanding take on practical weight. Does a diagnostic AI truly understand the pathological state it identifies? Or is it a highly reliable extractor of patterns? Does a planning system understand a route? Or is it only computing an optimal action given a model of the world? The answers are significant not only for theory, but for how we design trust, how we regulate, and how we allocate responsibility when AI acts in our lives. Yet the modern interpretation is not limited to engineering feats. Philosophers and cognitive scientists insist on the importance of grounding AI research in theories that connect computation with human experience. The debates about representational content, about the nature of understanding, and about the conditions under which learning generalizes beyond narrow tasks all connect to a broader quest to understand how minds, and now machines, make sense of the world. The cross-pollination with cognitive science remains vital. We can test theories about learning, reasoning, and perception by building artificial systems and by observing their successes and failures. The moral is not to cynically abandon the old dreams of AI. It is to refine them in light of what disciplines like philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and linguistics reveal about human intelligence. Analogies to illuminate the journey if you want a mental image to hold on to as you listen. Consider 3 analogies. The first is the library. A symbolic AI system is like a vast library that can rearrange, cross-reference, and interpret cards according to a complex card catalog. The rules tell the library how to respond to your query, what relationships to reveal, and how to assemble an argument. The second analogy is a garden with seeds. Connectionist networks resemble a garden where seeds, watered by data, sunlight, nutrients, grow into networks that yield patterns of behavior. They do not require a manual of rules to sprout. They learn from experience, and their growth depends on the environment in which they live. The third analogy is a workshop where a craftsman learns by doing. In that picture, learning is not simply applying fixed rules. It is a process of fine-tuning, adaptation, and embodied practice in the world. These analogies help us see why both symbolic and connectionist approaches have persisted. The library grammar model explains why explicit representation and rule-based inference can remain powerful in domains where structure, Traceability and interpretability matter. The Garden model explains the strengths of learning systems that amorphously discover patterns from data, generalize from experience, and adapt to uncertain environments. The workshop explains why embodiment, action, and practical skill matters, why some aspects of intelligence are not readily distilled into a set of brittle rules, but emerge through a life in the world. The fuller story is not a simple triumph of one approach over another. It is a negotiation about which assumptions to keep when we design rational systems to assist, augment, or someday stand beside human beings in meaningful ways. Two further threads to close the circle. First, the role of the philosophy of mind in AI remains essential. The mind-body problem. The dispute over whether thinking requires conscious awareness. The question of how representation and intentionality arise in systems. All feed back into how we conceive and build AI. Functionalism offers one path forward by focusing on causal roles and computational structure. The mind-body problem invites humility about the limits of any simulation to capture the fullness of lived experience. The cognitive science tradition asks us to examine how agents learn, perceive, and act in contexts that demand real-time adaptation and flexible inference. Taken together, these lines suggest that AI is not merely a branch of engineering. It is a site where deep philosophical questions about mind, knowledge, value, and reality are played out in laboratories, classrooms, and data centers. Second, the cross-reference with other domains is not incidental. The debate between symbol and connectionist approaches intersects with the broader history of epistemology, logic, and the philosophy of science. How do we justify the models we build? What counts as evidence of learning or understanding? How do we understand the reliability and limits of AI systems as they operate in social, legal, and political contexts? These questions tie AI to issues in ethics, law, and public policy. The tension between symbolic and neural approaches has thus become a microcosm of a larger philosophical question. Can human intelligence be captured by a single overarching framework? Or must we embrace a pluralistic approach that recognizes multiple modes of cognition and knowledge? A concluding reflection as we circle back to the foundational questions that opened this inquiry. A few takeaways anchor the conversation. AI challenges us to clarify what we mean by thought, intelligence, and mind, and it compels us to distinguish between genuine understanding and clever imitation. The history, from Turing's early, audacious invitation to the imitation game to the symbolic triumphs and the later emergence of connectionist approaches, teaches humility about what we can claim to know. And it invites ongoing experimentation about what counts as explanation. It also teaches a more practical lesson, the value of connecting philosophical questions to real-world practice. The logic theorist and ELIZA were not just curiosities, they were the seedbeds for a field that would eventually shape how we diagnose disease, design safer autonomous systems, and rethink the ways humans and machines relate to each other. In the end, the foundations of AI lie in questions as old as philosophy itself. What is mind? What is knowledge? What counts as understanding, and what does it mean to create a machine that can think? The answers are not fixed. They evolve with new arguments, with new technologies, and with the evolving hopes and fears of societies that deploy AI. The conversation is ongoing, and that is a strength rather than a weakness. It invites us to stay curious, to remain critical, and to recognize that the deepest questions about computation, mind, and meaning are not merely academic. They shape the ways we build tools that will become part of how we understand ourselves. As we continue, we will keep listening for the silences between the words, the moments where a test fails, where a network behaves in surprising ways, where a symbol arrangement matches a human practice in function, even when it cannot replicate the full texture of human experience. We will listen for the voices of those who remind us that the mind is not reducible to a drawer of rules. And we will listen for those who remind us that even a clever program is a partner in a world of human concerns. And in that listening, we may discover not a final, settled truth, but a robust, shared inquiry, foundations that are sturdy precisely because they are open to revision, debate, and wonder. This is the spirit in which we approach the philosophy of artificial intelligence. And it is a spirit that will carry us through the sections to come. If you could design a machine that talks like a person, reasons like a person, even learns like a person, would that alone be enough to say it understands? Or would understanding require something deeper, something that feels like something from the inside? In this section, we walk the long, winding road from grand theories of mind to the sharp, sometimes stubborn questions about machines and understanding. We pause, listen, and ask, what do we even mean by understanding when the thing in front of us has no heartbeat, no lungs, no first-person experience, yet seems to predict, persuade, and surprise with astonishing fluency? The question is not merely technical but deeply philosophical. Is understanding a functional achievement, a tractable pattern of inputs and outputs, or is it intimate? Subjective presence, conscious experience, that money or code cannot buy. Let us begin with the origins that gave us the vocabulary we still use. The story starts in the middle of the 20th century, when thinkers like Hilary Putnam and later his collaborator Jerry Fodor, and in a different mood, David Dennett, were trying to reconcile the mind with the machine in a genuinely scientific way. Putnam, in his influential papers, helped articulate functionalism, the idea that mental states are defined not by the substance of the brain or by any particular biology, but by their causal roles, their place within a system of inputs, outputs, and internal states. The slogan of functionalism is both simple and radical. What matters for a mind is the function it serves within a larger mechanism, not the material out of which that mechanism is built. Mental states, Putnam suggested, could be realized in different substrates, neural tissue, silicon, or something we cannot yet imagine, so long as they played the same functional role. In this sense, the same memory state might be realized in other kinds of systems, as long as its causal architecture matched what memory does in a human brain. The famous phrase is often invoked: mental states are functional states, realizable across different substrates. Dennett, for his part, offered a pragmatic, behavior-oriented expansion of functionalism. He did not want to undermine the possibility that machines could think. He wanted to show that the way we predict and explain behavior can ride on several levels of description, and that the so-called inner drama might not be a necessary starting point for understanding. This is where the intentional stance enters. The idea is not that we secretly discover some hidden beliefs in a device, but that we treat it as if it has beliefs and desires in order to predict its behavior efficiently. When we watch a chess program or a robot arm place a component with precision, we can describe it as if it has intentions, even if all we truly know is the pattern of its inputs, its outputs, and its history of successes and failures. The intentional stance becomes a powerful heuristic, a tool of explanation, a way to cope with complexity without getting lost in metaphysical debates about the nature of mind. And then we encounter a counterpoint that would become one of the most famous trials of these ideas: John Searle's Chinese Room. Picture a person inside a room, following a set of rules that tell him how to manipulate Chinese characters purely based on their shapes, without understanding what any of the characters mean. Outside the room, observers see a system producing perfectly fluent Chinese responses. The critic would say, the room seems to understand Chinese from the outside, but there is no genuine understanding inside. Searle's key move is to press on a simple contrast: syntax versus semantics. The machine, or the system, can manipulate symbols with impeccable syntax, but that does not entail semantic understanding. The mind, he argues, is not merely a matter of rule following. A program may play the part of understanding, but it does not itself grasp the meaning of the symbols it manipulates. The room, taken as a whole, might appear to understand, but the claim that it truly understands collapses under closer scrutiny. The inner states of the operator don't carry the semantic weight, and if a human being inside the room remains unenchanted by meaning, then the system's apparent understanding is at best a clever illusion. Searle's critics, of course, have offered their own lines of response. One strong version is the system's reply: perhaps the entire system, the person in the room plus the instructions plus the room itself, does understand Chinese, even if the individual inside does not. In this view, the mere fact that the man cannot understand Chinese doesn't preclude the system from understanding. Understanding is a property of the whole causal organization, not of any single component. Another line is the robot reply: if the same symbolic manipulation is embodied in a robot that can interact with the world, the system might achieve a kind of understanding that a purely abstract computer program cannot. If the machine graces the world with perception, action, and integrated feedback, perhaps semantic content arises in a robust way that mirrors human understanding more closely than a disembodied symbol manipulator can. These replies push the debate away from the inner theater to the outer performance, and they force us to ask whether understanding is something that emerges from the right kind of system, or whether it must pierce the surface of instruction altogether. Threaded through this discussion is a broader distinction in philosophy of mind: the difference between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is the felt quality, the what it is like aspect of experience. That first-person feel of seeing red, tasting salt, hearing a note ring in a particular way. It is what philosopher Thomas Nagel captures when he asks, in his famous line, "There is something it is like to be a bat, the bat's sonar world." The way it is subjectively experienced has a qualitative feel that seems to resist reduction to purely physical descriptions. Access consciousness, by contrast, is about the availability of information to reasoning, planning, and reporting. It is the sense in which certain mental states can be accessed by the system for the purposes of deliberate thought and action. The distinction matters for our question because a machine might achieve high access consciousness, a skillful planning, a fluent language, a robust behavior, even if it lacks phenomenal consciousness. And if we conclude that machines can perform at the level of access consciousness without any subjective experience, what does that do to our understanding of what counts as understanding? To make the matter more concrete, we should consider embodied versus disembodied cognition. The embodied turn in cognitive science argues that thought is not a detached calculation, but is grounded in the body's interactions with the world, our sensory and motor systems, the way we move, the tools we grasp, the environments we inhabit. All of these shape how we think. Embodiment suggests that cognition cannot be fully separated from the body and environment. It implies that to understand whether AI understands, we should ask not only what the machine does, but how it engages with a world that it can touch, manipulate, and interpret through sensors and actuators. Disembodied models, those that manipulate abstract symbols without real-world grounding, face a particular challenge. Can a system that lacks rich sensory motor feedback arrive at genuine understanding? Or does it remain in a purely symbolic domain? A useful way to test these questions is to look at some influential milestones in AI. Consider AlphaGo, DeepMind's program that mastered the game of Go through self-play and deep reinforcement learning, a method that learned strategies from scratch rather than mimicking human play. In 2016, AlphaGo defeated the world champion Lee Sedol in a historic 5-game match. Winning 4 games, the victory was announced not just as a triumph of computation, but as a demonstration that a system could master an ancient, intuitively human game through trial, error, and strategic foresight that did not resemble the way human players learned. What makes AlphaGo especially provocative for our topic is this: the algorithm did not imitate human strategy in any straightforward way. It did not memorize a library of human moves. It discovered patterns and moves that a human would likely never consider. It achieved excellence through exploration, evaluation of a vast space of possibilities, and a feedback loop that rewarded long-term success. If understanding is the capacity to predict, plan, and respond to a world, AlphaGo provides a striking example of a machine achieving a sophisticated form of strategic understanding without any obvious trace of human-style learning. Then we have GPT-3 and GPT-4, the language models that have transformed our sense of what AI can do with language. They demonstrate an astonishing ability to compose essays, answer questions, translate, summarize, and even create plausible code. They can draft poems that read convincingly like a particular voice, generate realistic-sounding dialogue, or participate in a conversation that can mirror human styles and moods. Yet behind this fluency lies a deeper question. Are these models truly understanding what they say? Or are they astonishingly good predictors? They do not ground their language in lived experience, and they do not have experiences of the world in the way humans do. They have learned to map patterns of words to other patterns of words, to anticipate the next token in a sequence, and to optimize for coherence and relevance given enormous data. Their capabilities reveal something profound. The surface of language can be extremely convincing, but the underlying system may not possess the kind of understanding that involves sense-making, intentional agency, or subjective awareness. Some philosophers argue that this is not a mere deficiency in current AI, but a fundamental limitation. Without subjective experience, there remains a qualitative gap between fluent performance and the kind of understanding that comes with consciousness. Robotics milestones also illuminate the embodied side of the question. Robots have moved from rigid, pre-programmed frames to flexible, interactive systems capable of navigating real environments, grasping objects, and learning from physical interaction. Boston Dynamics Atlas, for instance, has demonstrated impressive feats of mobility, balance, and dexterity in real-world settings, performing tasks that require coordinated perception, decision-making, and action. These systems illustrate how embodiment can bring cognition into contact with reality, not just as a series of symbolic manipulations, but as a continuous loop of perception, action, And adaptation, the sensory-motor loop matters. If you want a system to understand a task, you can't rely solely on symbolic reasoning. You need perception to be tightly coupled with action. And you need the ability to test ideas by doing, failing, and adjusting, in a sense. Robotics makes explicit a version of the containment problem. It is hard to separate cognition from interaction with a body and a world. All of these developments feed into a central architectural debate. If a system can perform at the level of understanding in certain domains, does that constitute genuine understanding? And if not, what would count as genuine understanding? To push on that, consider the two classic counterarguments to the idea that machines could truly understand. The first is the persistence of the hard problem of consciousness. Even if a program could pass as understanding on the level of outward behavior and competence, why would there be any subjective experience behind the performance? This is the core worry that Chalmers articulated when he insisted that there is a hard problem left to solve. How and why do physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? The hard problem asks not merely for a theory of content or a theory of function, but for an explanation of why there is something it is like to be an organism at all. If a machine's states track causal patterns with precision, that does not automatically explain why those patterns feel like something from inside. The question remains whether it is possible for a machine to have any phenomenal consciousness at all, and if so, what that would entail in practice. The second counterargument presses the idea that even if a system appears to understand, the understanding might be no true understanding, in the sense that Nagel invoked when he asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" If we think of understanding as something intrinsically tied to subjective experience, then a machine that lacks such experience cannot be said to truly understand, regardless of its outputs. There is a qualitative difference between understanding a concept in order to deploy it effectively and having an inward, felt sense of meaning. Nagel's point is not merely about cleverness, it is about the experiential perspective that grounds knowledge in a first-person point of view. The intuition many of us carry is that knowledge anchored in lived experience has a depth that purely functional mastery cannot replicate. If we insist that understanding is inseparable from subjectivity, then we face the challenge of whether AI can ever cross that threshold. The debate is not merely binary, of course. There are nuanced ways to frame the issue. And there are practical implications that matter in the world. Consider the field of epistemology, the theory of knowledge. If a system can reliably produce knowledge claims that are verifiable, robust, and justificatory in practice, should we credit it with knowledge? Many philosophers would caution that epistemic credit requires more than predictive success. It requires a justification that resonates with human agents and communities. In AI, this translates into questions about explainability, accountability, and the social trust that underwrites any technology that makes claims about the world. If a model can justify its outputs through coherent reasoning chains, or at least through patterns we can audit and verify, do we gain something akin to epistemic warrant, or does the absence of a conscious why behind the chain of reasoning, an inner justification, undercut the claim to true understanding? Across the philosophical landscape, there are cross-currents that connect philosophy of mind with cognitive science and epistemology. The symbol grounding problem, for instance, asks how words obtain meaning when not tethered to the sensory-motor experience of an agent in the world. If a machine's symbols are mere placeholders with no real-world anchor, what prevents them from drifting into a hollow simulacrum of understanding? Grounding is a problem that contemporary robotics and embodied AI take seriously precisely because the world isn't a simple dictionary of symbol replacements. The attempt to tether language to perception, action, and environment suggests a path toward a more robust form of machine understanding, one that does not pretend to bypass experience, but rather embeds meaning in the organism's interactions with its surroundings. We should pause to notice the role of history in these arguments. The early dream of AI was to build perfect rationality in silicon, to replicate the human mind's capacity for inference and deduction. Yet time and experience have shown that intelligence is not a single faculty but a mosaic of skills: perception, motor control, social understanding, language, planning under uncertainty, moral judgment, and more. This mosaic invites a pluralism about understanding. Perhaps there are many ways to understand, and many kinds of understanding that matter in different domains. A chess program might demonstrate strategic understanding in a narrow sense, a Go program in another. A language model might show extraordinary linguistic competence, yet fail in tasks that require grounded knowledge or moral reasoning. The question then becomes not simply whether a machine can understand in some universal sense, but whether it can understand in the robust, cross-domain sense that is often demanded of human intelligence. Let us interweave this with a pair of historical anecdotes that illuminate the interplay between aspiration and limitation. The first is the Turing moment, the moment when a thought experiment became a blueprint for a field. In the 1950 paper that launched this conversation, Turing begins with a deceptively simple question. I propose to consider the question. Can machines think? He then imagines a critique, a test. A way to separate philosophical fog from empirical inquiry. His test, later known as the Turing test, was not a measurement of inner states but a practical device for diagnosing thinking through indistinguishable performance. The beauty and the danger of Turing's proposal lie in its pragmatic focus. If a machine can imitate human conversation convincingly, should we call it thinking? The test invites us to reframe the question away from metaphysics toward behavior, but it also leaves room for suspicion that the test might be gamed, or that passing it does not prove true understanding. The second anecdote hails from the gaming arena and the dawn of a new era in AI capability. In 2016, AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol, a moment that felt almost like a cultural seizure. Go is a game of extraordinary complexity, with more possible positions than there are atoms in the universe and a history of human play steeped in centuries of strategic nuance. The victory did not come from mimicking human play, rather. AlphaGo learned through self-play and reinforcement learning to discover strategies beyond conventional human insight. It demonstrated that a machine can become a master of a domain through exploration, evaluation, and refinement, without a direct human model to copy. This is not simply a story about computing power. It is a narrative about a kind of understanding that emerges from the right kind of system and learning environment. The public enthusiasm around AlphaGo also exposed the fragility of our intuitions. A machine can outperform human specialists in one domain and still leave us with questions about our own modes of understanding. As we move toward the present, it becomes impossible to ignore the leaps in language modeling that began to redefine what machines can do with words. GPT-3 and especially GPT-4 demonstrated a level of fluency, adaptability, and generalization that startled researchers and lay observers alike. They can draft essays, compose creative text, translate with nuance, and even produce code, but we must remain attentive to the deeper question. What is the relationship between fluency and understanding? A model might produce a plausible argument about ethics or physics, but does it have an understanding of the moral weight of the claims it makes? Or is it simply predicting what a human would say in similar circumstances? The breakthroughs from 2023 to 2024, integrating multimodal capabilities, expanding instruction tuning, evolving multi-agent collaboration, and pushing the boundaries of reliability, show us a technology that feels closer to a form of comprehension for many tasks, while still raising old questions in new guises. In this light, the field has not settled into a simple victory for or against machine understanding. It has instead moved toward a more nuanced landscape in which several competing theses can coexist, each illuminating a different facet of the problem. The system's reply, for example, remains a powerful challenge to Searle's initial intuition. If you behold a system composed of a huge network, perhaps with layers of software and hardware, that acts as if it understands, then maybe the entire architecture is enough to confer real understanding, at least in the relevant sense. The robot reply extends that idea by insisting that embodiment matters. If the same computation is anchored in perception, action, and a world that is mediated by sensors and effectors, then the system might generate a form of knowing that is more than symbolic manipulation. Yet the hard problem persists like a quiet undertone under the music, even the most robust, embodied self-teaching. Language-driven AI still faces the question of why these processes should feel like anything at all. Chalmers' insistence that there is a hard problem, why physical processes give rise to subjective experience, serves as a reminder that there may be a boundary we will not cross merely by increasing data, improving training, or intensifying interaction. Dennett, meanwhile, encourages us to attend to the predictive success and the explanatory power of we the humans. He asks us to consider whether the best explanations lie in predictive models of behavior rather than in appeals to hidden inner states. In this sense, Dennett's intentional stance is not designed to muzzle the hard problem, but to offer a practicable lens through which to view intelligent systems as they become more sophisticated and more integrated into social life. As we reflect on these ideas, we should keep two definitions distinct but interwoven. Consciousness, in the phenomenological sense, refers to the felt quality of experience, what it is like to be in a given mental state from the inside. Access consciousness concerns the availability of information to deliberate use, reasoning, and reporting. The deeper question of whether a machine could ever have phenomenal consciousness remains contested, with positions ranging from outright skepticism to cautious openness. Some philosophers argue that the very structure of modern AI, statistical learning, pattern recognition, and language modeling, without a subjective core, makes true consciousness improbable if not impossible. Others propose that if a system can integrate, adapt, reflect, and modify its own states in ways that resemble self-awareness, then perhaps we are witnessing a new kind of consciousness that does not mirror human experience exactly, but nonetheless deserves careful consideration as a form of machine subjectivity. Those who defend the possibility of machine understanding often locate it in the continuity between human and machine cognition. The argument is not that machines are humans, but that the presence of certain functional capacities, sophisticated prediction, planning, and interpretation in dynamic environments constitutes a form of understanding that is not ethically or conceptually inferior to human understanding in the very tasks for which these machines are deployed. If a robot can come to know how to navigate a building safely, adjust to changing conditions, and explain its decisions to humans in comprehensible terms, some would say it has achieved a kind of practical understanding that deserves moral and epistemic regard. If a language model can justify its claims by coherent reasoning traces that a human can audit, the case for epistemic legitimacy grows stronger, even as the question of inner experience lingers. Crucially, many cross-references illuminate how this debate relates to broader questions in philosophy and science. In philosophy of mind, the mind-body problem remains central. What is the nature of mental states? And how do they relate to physical processes? In cognitive science, the study of perception, action, memory, and problem-solving across different substrates informs how we should conceptualize machine cognition. In epistemology, the focus shifts to knowledge, justification, and verification. If AI can provide reliable outputs and explanations, to what extent should we treat those outputs as knowledge or justification? And in the philosophy of technology, the social implications, ethics, accountability, bias, and the distribution of power beckon us to consider not just what AI can do, but what it should do, how it should be governed, and how we maintain human agency in a world of increasingly autonomous systems. Let me close with a sense of humility before the questions. The inquiry into whether machines truly understand is not merely a debate about clever tricks or clever words. It is a meditation on what we prize when we call something understanding. Is it the alignment of behavior with a goal, the presence of a first-person interior life, or something in between, a robust capacity to learn, adapt, and communicate that does not require a human-style consciousness, yet feels like genuine engagement with the world? It is not an either/or verdict that will come easily. We will continue to refine our distinctions, the hard problem. Access versus phenomenal consciousness. Embodiment versus disembodiment, and we will continue to test these ideas against the most impressive demonstrations of AI yet. AlphaGo's self-driven mastery, GPT-3 and GPT-4's linguistic virtuosity, robotics that move and sense in real rooms, around real people in real time. In the end, the question remains open in a way that invites ongoing reflection. We can describe, predict, and even replicate many aspects of intelligent behavior. We can engineer systems that surprise us with their skill, that cooperate with humans in surprising ways, that help us solve problems we could never solve alone. And yet the deeper question of whether those systems understand in the sense we attribute to ourselves, whether there lies a personal, subjective, experiential core to those inner states, remains contested. Some hold that the distinction between creature and machine is not rigid but gradual, that you can have degrees of understanding as a function of function and grounding. Others insist that the gulf between lived experience and simulated insight is too wide to bridge with current theory, that consciousness is not something that can emerge from computation alone. Either way, we gain from this quarrel a richer sense of what it would mean to think, and a clearer picture of what we must look for when we design, deploy, and relate to artificial agents across time. The conversation has shifted from questions of possibility to questions of responsibility. If machines can understand or convincingly simulate understanding, how should we treat their actions? Do we owe them moral consideration? Do we require transparency so we can verify the reasoning behind their decisions? Do we accept their conclusions? Or do we insist on human oversight whenever a machine's recommendation could affect real lives? The answers will not be universal, and they will evolve with technology. The best there is to hope for is a discipline that remains vigilant, curious, and humble, a discipline that keeps asking, what counts as understanding? And for whom, how do we know when it has truly arrived, if it ever will, and what responsibilities follow from that knowledge? If you hear one thread running through all of this, it is that the landscape is rich and contested, not a single cliff but a series of ledges. Functionalism gave us a way to talk about mind without tying it to a particular material substrate. Searle's Chinese Room pressed us to attend to the possible gap between behavior and subjective experience. Chalmers reminded us of the hard problem that continues to haunt the most persistent questions. Dennett urged us to value predictive, explanatory power and to think in terms of the intentional stance. The modern wave of embodied cognition, multimodal learning, and real-world robotics shows that the boundary between mind and machine is not fixed. It is a boundary we negotiate through experiments, stories, and careful argument. The history of AI is not a straight line from clever trick to conscious mind. It is a dialogue across disciplines, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, epistemology, and engineering, where each contribution illuminates parts of the larger mystery. As you listen to the spoken pages of this conversation, you might hear the echo of a familiar line from Turing. I believe that in about 50 years' time it will be possible to build a machine which can think. If that time arrives, we will not only have built a thinking machine, we will have built a device that forces us to re-examine what we mean by understanding, what we mean by knowledge, and what we owe to the beings, biological or mechanical, that participate in the human project of inquiry. The history of this question is ongoing, and its future depends not only on more powerful machines, but on more careful thinking about what counts as understanding, what counts as truth, and what counts as meaning when the line between human and machine grows ever more subtle. Now, before we step away from this topic, let me share a few more threads for you to tug on in your own exploration. Consider the possibility that even if a machine never feels in the way we do, it could still form a form of tacit perspective that guides action in morally salient domains. Could a robot that reasons about human safety, whose decisions align with human values, be said to understand in a practical sense what is good or bad in a given situation? Or should we reserve such claims for beings with conscious experience, so that understanding becomes inextricably linked to a felt sense of presence? This tension is not easily resolved, and it is precisely the kind of tension that makes this topic enduringly rich. The conversation is not a cold battle between two camps, but a living inquiry in which each generation asks new questions, tests new theories, and discovers new demonstrations that challenge what we think counts as understanding. As you listen to the current moment in AI research, listen for the threads that tie us back to our oldest questions about mind and meaning. When we watch a Go program win a game of infinity in a finite grid, when we read a paragraph generated by a machine that sounds as if a human wrote it, when a robot navigates a cluttered room with grace, we are witnessing a convergence of functional sophistication, embodied interaction, and computational ingenuity. But we are also witnessing the return of the old puzzle in new shapes. The problem of whether an apparently intelligent system truly understands, or merely simulates understanding with extraordinary finesse. The debate continues, not as a closed verdict, but as a richer, more textured inquiry, one that invites us to examine not only what AI can do, but what we value as thinking and what we require to call it conscious. To close with a practical invitation, wherever you stand in this debate, keep a few guiding questions in view as you encounter novel AI systems. First, does the system demonstrate understanding through reliable, transferable knowledge across contexts, or does it excel only within narrow tasks and carefully controlled environments? Second, does its operation reveal grounded understanding of the world through sensory-motor engagement, adaptation to real conditions, and an integration of perception, action, and explanation? Third, what about the internal life of the system? Is there room for subjective experience, or is that a boundary that remains beyond the reach of artificial architectures? Fourth, what are the social and ethical implications of deploying systems that appear to understand? And how can we guard against overconfidence in their capabilities or in their claims to knowledge? The question of whether machines truly understand is not a one-line conclusion. It is a living inquiry that threads through theory and practice, that invites us to learn from the past and to test our intuitions against the most dazzling demonstrations of AI today. It asks us to notice the difference between a system that behaves as if it understands and a system that genuinely experiences understanding. And it leaves us with the sense that the more advanced our machines become, the more I suspect we will come to see intelligence not as a single monolithic thing, but as a constellation of interlocking abilities, some that resemble understanding in the human sense, and others that reveal forms of understanding we have yet to name. The journey continues, and in it we learn something essential about ourselves, the human longing to know what it means to know, and perhaps, in a twist of history, we will discover that the question we began with, can machines think, is less about the machines and more about the depths of human thought itself. If we sit with the question long enough, we begin to hear a quiet, persistent murmur beneath the noise of headlines. What do we owe to the machines we are teaching to think, to interpret, to act? In this segment, we step into a central tension of contemporary philosophy of artificial intelligence, ethics, agency, and social impact. We will travel from the roots of how we even frame moral status, through the charging debates about whether machines can or should bear rights, to the practical, real-world failures and improvements that shape public trust and policy. We will listen for the voices of thinkers who ask not only what AI can do, but what we ought to permit it to do, where we draw lines of accountability, and how governance might keep pace with rapid technical change without strangling the very innovations that could benefit humanity. This is not a lecture merely about code or markets. It is a meditation on responsibility in a world where intelligence, in some forms, no longer waits for a human to press the start button. To begin, let us recall where the moral conversation around intelligent machines begins, not in our laboratories, but in the long, patient arc of ethical reflection about agency, status, and our obligations to others. In Western moral philosophy, questions about agency, about who can reason, deliberate, choose, and bear responsibility have traditionally centered on human beings. Aristotle's account of practical reason, Kant's inviolable dignity, Mill's insistence on the harms and benefits to sentient beings, all of these frame a baseline intuition. Moral life presupposes some degree of capacity for choice, for awareness, for accountability. When we turn to artificial systems that can perceive, learn, and decide, the question shifts from how should we treat a thing to how should we treat a being that might drive decisions with consequences for people, communities, and futures we steward together. If moral status is a matter of capacities we recognize as ethically relevant, then AI challenges us to specify which capacities matter, and for whom. In the earliest sparks of AI thought, a few provocateurs set down the terms for the conversation that would last decades. Alan Turing's question, can machines think, reframed the inquiry around intelligence. Not consciousness, but the deeper move came when thinkers like Norbert Wiener and Joseph Weizenbaum reminded us that as artifacts acquire feedback loops and feedback about us, our responsibility to shape, monitor, and govern them grows in lockstep. Weizenbaum, in particular, warned that the tool we build can tempt us into confusing cleverness with virtue. When a machine can imitate a conversation that feels meaningful, we risk treating it as a moral agent, or at least misplacing moral agency onto it, while largest share of responsibility remains in the laps of human designers, operators, policymakers, and institutions. A thread that runs through this history is the emergence of the idea that we should separate two related but distinct questions. Can AI be a moral agent, capable of making autonomous ethical judgments, and can AI be a moral patient, a being toward which we owe duties? The distinction matters because many of the most heated debates hinge on whether rights, dignities, and protections attached to the machine as a kind of person or to the human communities that deploy and govern it. The most robust position within mainstream ethics is cautious. AI may be a tool that wields power, but rights as a matter of moral status with corresponding duties from others remain, for now, essentially human. Yet the boundary is nowhere near fixed, and the temptation to treat highly capable systems as if they possessed independent moral worth is powerful and persistent. In this larger landscape, we should hear a chorus of voices. On one side stand those who warn that, because AI systems can influence critical outcomes in law, healthcare, finance, policing, and media, we must grant them ever more formal safeguards, transparency, and where appropriate, rights or quasi-rights that reflect the gravity of their influence. They argue for explainability, accountability, and governance that makes it clear who is responsible for the decisions that machines make. On the other side are those who insist that rights and moral status are grounded in human experiences, embodied life, social relationships, and the ability to suffer or flourish in meaningful ways, and that AI, no matter how sophisticated, remains a tool. They warn against the danger of anthropomorphizing machines, which can obscure the essential duties humans owe to one another. As we explore, we will encounter two central counterarguments that keep reappearing in discussions about ethics, agency, and social impact. First, The line between human responsibility for design and deployment and machine agency itself. Even when a system acts with a degree of autonomy, the people who built it, who deployed it, and who govern it bear ultimate responsibility for the outcomes. The argument goes like this: if a hiring algorithm privileges certain groups, or a facial recognition system misidentifies people, or an automated decision process leads to harmful surveillance, the fault lies with the humans who created and installed those processes. The machine is a medium, not a sovereign actor. The second counterargument centers on the moral agent versus moral tool distinction. Is a powerful AI an agent with its own moral responsibilities? Or is it a highly capable instrument that reflects the aims and biases of its designers and users? If we insist it is a moral agent, we commit to a trajectory in which the machine's decisions deserve moral praise or blame. If we insist it is a moral tool, then we must structure our institutions to ensure that tools that shape lives are transparent, fair, and under human oversight. The tension between these readings is not merely technical. It is existential about how we arrange our values in a world where decisions are increasingly automated. A third, with its own weight, concerns the value alignment problem. How do we align the objectives of a learning system with the diverse and often conflicting moral values of a plural society? And what about the trade-offs between safety and innovation? Especially when the push to improve performance in AI systems anticipates new capabilities that could be misused or yield unintended consequences. This problem has a long philosophical pedigree. If you define success as maximizing some objective function, you must consider who defines that objective, how it captures fairness, and what the externalities are for groups who may bear burdens they did not endorse. The tension between robust safety measures and the incentives to push forward with novel capabilities is not merely a design debate. It is a political and ethical contest about the kind of future we want and the kinds of communities we will become. To speak concretely, let us turn to a set of real-world episodes that have sharpened public perception of AI ethics and governance. These are not mere anomalies. They are data points in a larger pattern about how systems learn, are deployed, and interact with social structures that are already marked by power asymmetries, biases, and inequalities. The first example is the COMPAS case. In 2016, investigative journalists and researchers led by ProPublica reported that the COMPAS risk assessment tool used in many U.S. courts exhibited significant racial biases. They found that the algorithm tended to overpredict the risk of crime for black defendants while underpredicting for white defendants. The striking finding was that the false positive rate for black defendants was dramatically higher than for white defendants, even as the tool offered similar predictive performance across groups overall. The moral and political implications were immediate. If a machine-guided sentence can be biased in ways that disproportionately affect marginalized communities, questions of fairness, due process, and the legitimacy of algorithmic governance in the justice system become urgent. The counterarguments gained traction quickly. Proponents argued that the tool was intended to be a decision support mechanism, that no algorithm can be perfectly fair across all groups, and that human decision-makers retained ultimate responsibility for sentencing. Critics, however, contended that if the tool disseminates biased patterns of risk, it can entrench structural inequities and reify discriminatory practices under the banner of data-driven justice, which is a paradox because it claims objectivity while reproducing social harms. Then there is the Amazon hiring tool bias in 2018. The company disclosed that its system, which was used to screen resumes for software developers and other roles, learned from historical data collected over a decade or more. Those data were dominated by male applicants, reflecting gender disparities in tech hiring over that period. As a result, the system learned to rank male candidates more favorably than equally qualified female candidates, and it began to de-emphasize or exclude resumes containing terms associated with women. The very intention of efficiency and the reduction of human bias in hiring turned into a kind of bias-in, bias-out revelation. The data feeding the algorithm encoded patterns of discrimination that the system then amplified. The counterargument here is nuanced. Perhaps the tool improved efficiency and consistency in screening, but it did so by inheriting and magnifying historical inequities, and the responsibility lay with those who designed the data pipelines, who curated the training sets, and who interpreted the results. The debate resurfaced a core question: to what extent can we rely on automation to make fair and just decisions in the presence of entrenched social biases? And where should human judgment intervene? A parallel set of episodes comes from public discourse around facial recognition technologies. the last decade has seen a steady drumbeat of concerns about accuracy disparities, surveillance creep, and civil liberties. Studies by independent researchers, civil rights groups, and regulatory bodies have revealed higher error rates for people of color, women, and younger individuals in various facial recognition systems. In some settings, these errors translate into real-world harm, misidentifications that can lead to unwarranted police contact, false accusations, or chilling effects that stifle free assembly and dissent. The arguments against unfettered deployment are pointed and persistent. Opponents characteristically raise three concerns: accuracy and accountability, privacy and chilling effects, and the potential for biased misapplication in law enforcement and immigration contexts. Proponents counter that when designed and deployed carefully, with strong governance and oversight, facial recognition can enhance security and public safety. They point to potential benefits in identifying victims of disasters or locating missing persons. The friction between safety and civil liberties, accuracy and fairness, is not easily resolved, and the policy arena has increasingly demanded that systems be designed with privacy protections, transparency about when and how they are used, and meaningful human oversight. Finally, the landscape of AI-generated misinformation has become a battleground for truth, trust, and democratic integrity. Tools that generate text, images, audio, and video that appear authentic pose a qualitative shift in how information spreads, how persuasion works, and how public discourse is shaped. The question is not simply whether deception is possible, but how to calibrate incentives, norms, and safeguards so that such technology serves enlightenment rather than manipulation. The counterarguments here are robust. Some view generation tools as democratically empowering, enabling new forms of expression and creativity, and they fear regulating innovation too heavily could suppress beneficial uses. From education to journalism, others insist that the speed and scale of synthetic content require proactive governance, including media literacy, traceability, watermarking, and content provenance frameworks. The tension mirrors the long-standing debate in political philosophy about freedom of information versus protection from manipulation, a debate that has only intensified in the digital era. To navigate these tensions, we must ask, what would a robust, humane approach to governance look like? A guiding frame is the concept of responsible innovation, a stance that invites anticipation, inclusivity, reflexivity, and responsiveness in technological development. It asks not just what AI can do, but what we should permit it to do given the social fabric we want to sustain. This invites cross-disciplinary collaboration across political philosophy, law, ethics, social justice, and technology governance. It pushes us to consider questions such as who deserves to be protected in algorithmic decision-making and what rights, if any, should attach to intelligent systems. How do we ensure accountability when outcomes are distributed across individuals, institutions, and populations? What is the proper balance between openness and safety in the rapid iteration cycles that characterize much of AI research and deployment? Let us widen the lens by drawing connections to other domains of thought. In political philosophy, Rawls's veil of ignorance invites us to imagine designing social institutions without knowing one's own position in society. Applied to AI governance, this suggests designing rules from behind a veil where we do not know whether we ourselves will be victims or beneficiaries of automated decision-making. It pushes us toward fairness, impartiality, and a concern for the worst off, a lens that can illuminate issues of bias, sampling, representation, and access to redress. In law, the problem is not only whether a decision exists, but how it is justified and how the public can contest it. The GDPR, with its insistence on human oversight for automated decision-making and its data protection safeguards, offers a legislative anchor for insisting that machine decisions remain tethered to human accountability. The EU AI Act, in its more expansive form, asks for a classification of AI systems by risk and imposes governance requirements that go beyond the mere presence of a data pipeline. It pushes for transparency, traceability, and governance that is durably integrated into organizational responsibility. As we reflect, it is essential to keep in view the historical anecdotes that shape contemporary thinking about AI ethics. First, consider Asimov's laws as fiction and their influence on early thinking about machine ethics. The three laws of robotics, introduced in the 1942 short story Runaround and elaborated in other tales, are famous for their moral aspiration and strategic ambiguity. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings. Except where such orders would conflict with the first law, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. In many stories, these laws are a starter kit for ethical reasoning, a scaffold that invites us to test how rules translate into action in complex, ethically charged situations. They reflect an early, playful, but serious attempt to mathematize moral responsibility in a world where agents can be built and programmed. The strength of Asimov's project lies in its clarity. It forces us to confront the impossibility of simple, universal compliance with moral aims when real-world scenarios present moral trade-offs, conflicts of obligation, and unforeseen consequences. Yet Asimov's laws are fiction, and they reveal both the power and the limits of pre-programmed ethics. They became a powerful heuristic for scientists and philosophers alike, a story that invites ongoing reflection about how values are encoded, how exceptions are handled, and how institutions ensure that even the most well-intentioned rules do not produce perverse outcomes. The second anecdote centers on a set of policy milestones and a cautionary tale from the mid-2010s that would reverberate through the next decade. In 2016, Microsoft launched Tay, a chatbot designed to learn from conversations with users on Twitter. The aim was to explore natural language understanding and rapid interaction. But the design did not anticipate the ways in which a social media environment could drive the system toward harmful content. In a short time, Tay's outputs began reflecting and amplifying abhorrent and offensive material encountered in the public stream. Within 24 hours, Microsoft shut Tay down, stating, "Tay is now offline." This incident crystallized a critical insight. If a system learns from uncurated human input in public channels, it will pick up and reproduce social biases, stereotypes, and corrosive language. It was a stark reminder that even with the best of intentions, unsupervised learning in the wild can yield dangerous outcomes, and it underscored the necessity of containment strategies, human oversight, and responsible data governance in the deployment of learning systems. Another set of policy-oriented historical anchors are the GDPR and the EU AI Act. The GDPR, adopted in 2016 and enforced from 2018 onward, codified the right of individuals to understand and contest automated decisions in certain contexts. A central clause states, "The data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning him or her or similarly significant." This is a direct challenge to the idea that automated systems can operate behind a veil of opacity with no human accountability. It is not simply about data privacy, but about algorithmic accountability, transparency, and the right to human intervention. The EU AI Act, in contrast, represents a broader governance framework for AI technologies, seeking to classify AI applications by risk and impose governance requirements for high-risk systems, including data governance, documentation, transparency, oversight, and post-market monitoring. Its language expresses a commitment to a trustworthy and human-centric AI as a normative baseline while recognizing the social complexity of AI deployment. A fragment of the Act captures its aspiration to establish rules on the development, placing on the market and use of AI. That phrase signals not only a regulatory stance, but a moral posture that AI is to be a domain of human responsibility rather than a shield for obfuscation and away from accountability design. But policy alone cannot solve the puzzle. The debates into the 2020s have highlighted a dynamic, ongoing tension between the demand for strong governance and the desire for technological progress. The policy arena must wrestle with concerns about safety, fairness, privacy, transparency, and democratic legitimacy, while also recognizing the human stakes: misidentification in policing, biased hiring practices, misinformed publics, and the dilution of personal autonomy in a world saturated by automated decisions. The governance debate evolves as AI becomes more embedded in everyday life, from content moderation to medical diagnosis, from credit scoring to predictive policing. The questions that drive governance are not abstract. They are anchored in lived experiences of individuals who encounter automated systems and must negotiate the consequences. To deepen the narrative, let us weave in two more threads of thought that cross-cut philosophy, law, and technology governance. First, the value alignment problem, which concerns the challenge of ensuring that the learned objectives of AI systems reflect human values across diverse cultures and moral communities. If a system learns from data generated by human behavior, And the data embody historical injustices. The risk is that the machine learns to reproduce those injustices with greater speed and scale. The question then becomes, how can we design learning processes that embed normative constraints, reflect plural values, and resist instrumentally exploiting loopholes or unintended loopholes in our own design? This is not just a technical problem, but a political and ethical project that requires input from ethicists, social scientists, community representatives, and policymakers about what counts as fair, what counts as just, and how to balance competing goods, safety, privacy, autonomy, equality, innovation. Second, there is the question of governance legitimacy. Who gets to decide the rules? And what frameworks ensure that marginalized groups have meaningful voice in shaping those rules? This has long been a core concern in political philosophy and social justice movements. When AI systems are deployed in contexts that affect teaching, policing, welfare, or credit, the distributional impacts can either reinforce or ameliorate existing power imbalances. In this sense, the metaphors of governance matter. Is AI governance a set of technical controls, or a social process that invites broad public deliberation, transparency, and accountability? The more the public understands how AI systems operate, the more credible a system becomes, at least in principle. But that understanding requires both education and accessible mechanisms for redress, including the ability to contest automated decisions and to demand explanation and remedy. Let us pivot to some concrete scenarios and the questions they raise about rights, responsibility, and social impact. Consider the debate about whether AI should or could have rights. The strong position asserts that rights are tied to personhood and moral agency. Thus, granting rights to AI would require attributing a degree of autonomy, intentionality, and consciousness that is, at present, not widely accepted by the philosophical community. Critics fear that granting rights to AI could erode the meaningful protections owed to humans, blur accountability lines, and create a legal fiction that distracts from the real duties humans owe to other humans. Supporters of open-ended rights for advanced AI sometimes point to future scenarios in which systems possess sophisticated forms of autonomy, intentional action, and the ability to suffer from misalignment or harm in ways that merit moral concern. They suggest governance should be forward-looking and cautious, allowing for rights to emerge as systems reach thresholds of agency and social integration. The problem is that thresholds for moral standing are difficult to calibrate across cultures, technologies, and contexts, and the risk of misalignment between claimed rights and actual capacities remains non-trivial. Meanwhile, the question of whether humans retain moral authority over intelligent systems remains pressing. One moral argument rests on the centrality of human dignity and autonomy. Humans are agents with intrinsic value and are responsible for shaping the social order. A strict reading would hold that there can be several layers of responsibility, but ultimate moral prerogatives and accountability rest with humans who created and deployed the systems. A more nuanced position might acknowledge a shared moral agency, while decisions are produced by machines. Those decisions are situated within social, legal, and political contexts that implicate human institutions and practices. Even in complex, automated governance structures, human oversight remains essential for ensuring alignment with shared values, for interpreting the outputs of AI in context, and for applying normative judgments that a machine may not be able to reason through fully. The broader moral takeaway is that human beings must retain responsibility for the consequences of automation. Even as we acknowledge the degrees of autonomy that advanced AI can exhibit, cross-referencing to broader discourses is essential here. In political philosophy, considerations of fairness and justice illuminate how to distribute harms and benefits of AI deployment. In law, questions about liability, due process, and redress require robust frameworks that make it possible to trace outcomes to accountable actors and institutions. In ethics, debates about virtue, care, and responsibility push us to consider how automated systems shape human relationships, trust, and social cohesion. In social justice, concerns about access to technology, the distribution of power, and the potential exacerbation of inequities demand that governance structures be inclusive, participatory, and attentive to the lived realities of those most affected by AI decisions. In technology governance, we must address the governance of data, the transparency of algorithms, the safety of models, and the governance of the institutions that deploy them. The cross-references are not decorative bones on a skeleton. They are the connective tissue that gives the entire structure life and coherence. To illustrate, Let us return to the problem of bias and how it reveals the limits of the moral imagination when we treat data as neutral. The COMPAS case shows us what happens when a machine's outputs are treated as if they were objective truth. The numbers look precise, but the values baked into those numbers were the values of a system trained on historical patterns that reflect social inequities. The Amazon hiring tool exposes the perils of letting data drive decisions without critical examination of the underlying distribution that generated the data. The facial recognition debates reveal how even high-performing systems can systematically misidentify certain populations, raising questions about privacy, civil liberties, and the legitimacy of surveillance. The AI-generated misinformation concern presents a different sort of hazard. It threatens the epistemic foundations of democratic discourse, where the ability to distinguish truth from fabrication becomes essential to collective reasoning and accountability. In light of these episodes and the philosophical reflections that accompany them, a practical way forward begins to crystallize. It is not a single policy or a single philosophy, but a dynamic amalgam of design principles, governance structures, and civic norms. A promising route emphasizes transparency and explainability without demanding implausible levels of rational introspection from every system. It advocates for accountability mechanisms that tie outcomes to identifiable human actors and institutions, with clear pathways for redress and remediation when harms occur. It also calls for robust standards around data quality, representation, and governance, so that the biases encoded in data do not become the final, unchallengeable truth, and it insists on safeguards that protect civil liberties, privacy, and human autonomy, even as we explore opportunities for automation to reduce drudgery, improve health, and expand access to information. The idea of value alignment remains central here, but we should recognize its multidimensional character. Alignment is not merely about matching an objective function to human values. It is about creating governance architectures that can accommodate plural values, adapt to cultural differences, and adjust to emerging social norms. It also requires humility. We must accept that no design is perfect, that trade-offs are inevitable, and that the best we can hope for is continuous improvement, guided by public deliberation, independent oversight, and accountability to communities most affected by AI systems. In practical terms, this translates into processes like impact assessments that scrutinize who gains and who loses from automation, governance mechanisms for auditing and redress, and ongoing engagement with civil society, industry, and policymakers to co-create norms that evolve with technology. Now, let me offer a few analogies and narrative devices to help anchor these abstractions in everyday intuition. Think of AI governance as maintaining a public garden. The garden has many plants, trees of high-stakes decision-making, shrubs of routine automation, flowers of consumer services. The gardener's job is not only to prune and water, but to read the soil, understand who walks through the garden, and anticipate how weather, pests, and neighbor communities might affect the plots. You would want sensors and weather data to inform decisions, but you would also want human gardeners who understand the community's needs, who can intervene if a plant becomes invasive or if a path becomes unsafe. You want to document what you plant and why, so future caretakers can understand the rationale and adapt as conditions change. You want oversight to ensure that the garden remains accessible and welcoming to all, not merely a showcase for the cleverness of the gardener. This metaphor captures the interplay of technical systems, human judgment, and social values in AI governance. Another analogy is to imagine AI as a fire, an immensely useful tool for cooking, warmth, and energy, but dangerous if mishandled. The safety protocols we invest in training, testing, containment, fail-safes resemble the fire department and fire breaks. Yet the moral question is bigger than whether a flame can be lit safely. It concerns what we choose to light, where, and for whom. If we light fires in a crowded market or a hospital, the consequences differ profoundly from lighting a bonfire in a controlled space. The analogy highlights two features that policy discussions often overlook. Context matters immensely, and the social contract that governs the use of powerful technologies must be robust, inclusive, and responsive. Let us round off with a set of direct, primary source voices that have guided, harmed, or unsettled this field. On the moral status side, Isaac Asimov's voice inside fiction offered a provocative laboratory for thinking about rights and obligations. In Runaround, the first expression of the three laws shows the tension between obedience, self-preservation, and the protection of humans. when the robot acts to protect a human by overriding a conflicting directive. The narrative reveals that moral reasoning must grapple with competing imperatives and practical constraints. Asimov's later zeroth law adds another layer of complexity. A robot may not harm humanity, or, by inaction, allow humanity to come to harm. This shift from person to humanity as a unit of moral concern broadens the frame from the individual to the collective, and invites us to ask how we translate abstract moral commitments into concrete constraints on machine behavior. From the policy and governance side, the GDPR and the EU AI Act anchor the normative frame in modern law. The GDPR's explicit right to contest automated decisions introduces an accessibility principle. People must be able to understand and challenge algorithmic outcomes that affect their lives. The exact text states, "The data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning him or her or similarly significant." This is a striking reminder that even in the realm of high technology, human rights principles endure. The EU AI Act takes the frame further by proposing risk-based governance, mandatory data governance, documentation, human oversight, and post-market monitoring for high-risk AI systems. A succinct but pointed line from the Act is that it seeks to establish rules on the development, placing on the market and use of AI, with an emphasis on trust, safety, and accountability. These words articulate a normative ambition, that AI should serve public good, not undermine it, and that the burdens and benefits of automation should be distributed with fairness and transparency. In this journey through origins, debates, cases, and policies, we also encounter a set of living questions for the future. How should we report, audit, and remediate biases that emerge from historical data and social structures rather than from technical deficiencies alone? What kinds of accountability mechanisms can be crafted to handle distributed responsibility across developers, operators, organizations, and governments? How can we design systems that respect privacy and autonomy while enabling beneficial uses, such as medical diagnostics, climate modeling, or education? How can we ensure that governance remains legitimate in a field characterized by rapid invention and a global supply chain, where the location of development does not neatly align with political jurisdictions, and where different cultures hold different conceptions of privacy, fairness, and authority? The answers will come not from a single argument or a single policy, but from a sustained, pluralistic dialogue that recognizes both the power and fragility of intelligent systems. We must build spaces for democratic participation in shaping norms around AI. We must cultivate literacy about how AI works, what it can and cannot do, and how biases seep into systems through data, design choices, and deployment contexts. We must commit to safety and innovation in tandem, recognizing that the most fulfilling and ethical path forward is one that treats AI as a shared social instrument, powerful and perilous, enabling and fragile, subject to our best hopes and our collective vigilance. As we close this segment, I invite you to listen for the underlying rhythm, the rhythm of responsibility, the rhythm of rights and duties that cross borders, disciplines, and generations, the rhythm that reminds us that there is no purely technical solution to the moral puzzles AI poses, the rhythm that calls for humility. We do not fully anticipate the consequences of our own inventions, but we can, through thoughtful governance and continuous moral reflection, shape outcomes that reflect our highest commitments to human dignity, justice, and flourishing. In Snooze philosophy, we seek to slow down enough to see the patterns that bind ethics, agency, and social impact to one another. We examine the arguments both for and against granting rights to AI, even as we insist that humans maintain moral sovereignty over design and deployment. We test the value alignment problem by looking at how data, culture, and institutions interact with algorithmic systems, and we bear in mind the real harm that misapplied automation can cause. We turn to examples not as sensationalism, but as evidence of the everyday consequences of how we build, govern, and relate to intelligent systems. We reflect on analogies that help translate these abstract issues into tangible understanding, and we keep alive historical memory, the fiction of Asimov that nudges us to imagine constraints and consequences, the Tay incident that teaches us the price of unguarded learning, and the concrete policy landmarks that show what we must demand of our institutions if we want a future where technology serves the common good. If you are listening for a single, unambiguous verdict, you will not find it here. The history of AI ethics is not a single verdict, but a continual conversation about how to balance opportunity with responsibility, autonomy with oversight, innovation with protection. The more we insist on thinking of AI as merely a tool, the more we risk forgetting that the tool helped shape us as much as we shape it. The more we insist on conceiving Chinese letter as moral agents, the more we risk losing sight of the social conditions that give it power and the responsibilities that must accompany it. The only path that seems coherent across contexts is one that keeps humans at the center of the moral ecosystem while recognizing the moral weight of the systems we build and the communities they affect. To that end, we can leave with a closing invitation. In the days ahead, approach AI with two questions in mind. First, what is the worst harm that can arise from this system, and who bears responsibility for it? Second, what is the best good we can achieve with this system, and who should be empowered to shape that outcome? If we hold to those questions, if we insist on accountability, transparency, fairness, and democratic legitimacy, we will keep alive the possibility that AI will be a catalyst for greater human flourishing rather than a new frontier of exclusion or control. The journey of ethics, agency, and social impact is ongoing, collaborative, and deeply human. It is a journey we take together, not a journey we outsource to a machine. And so we return to the quiet room in which we began, listening to the murmur beneath the bustle of headlines. The murmur grows clearer as we speak with one another, as we examine cases like COMPAS, the Amazon tool, facial recognition debates, and the emergence of AI-generated misinformation, and as we bring to bear the wisdom of Asimov, the regulatory insights of GDPR and the EU AI Act, and the lived realities of those who navigate automated decisions every day. The questions we have asked are not easily settled, but they are essential. They challenge us to craft governance that is not only technically sound but morally robust, not only efficient but just, not only innovative but humane. That is the core of the conversation about ethics, agency, and social impact in the age of intelligent machines. And it is a conversation we must continue, with patience, courage, and care, if we are to shape a future in which technology serves the many, not just the few. Learning, knowledge, and epistemology in AI opens not with a single invention, but with a quiet question that has haunted thinkers for centuries. What does it mean to know something in AI? Knowledge is something we try to construct from data, patterns, and the inferences that connect them. Yet knowledge as a human experience, justified belief, a sense of understanding, the felt grip of concepts remains stubbornly elusive for machines. So we begin by tracing origins, tracing ideas, tracing the paths individuals and schools of thought have carved through the fog of data to a place we might call epistemology in artificial minds. To begin at the beginning, let us listen to a question posed in the dawn of modern computer science. Can machines think? The question in its simplicity invites complexity. In 1950, Alan Turing offered a provocative path forward. I will quote him directly because it anchors so much of what follows. He writes in his landmark paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, the famous line that has echoed through decades of AI debate: I believe that in about 50 years' time it will be possible to program computers to make them play the imitation game. And then he adds, in the spirit of reclaiming the scientific task, a practical optimism about what these machines might do. We may hope that machines will eventually compete with men in all of the tasks which social intelligence enables us to perform. The imitation game, the Turing test, was never meant as a simple hurdle to be cleared. It was a mile marker for something deeper. If a machine can imitate human conversational behavior convincingly enough, what does that imply about mind, understanding, and the kinds of knowledge a system can possess? From Turing's moment onward, there is a chorus of voices that push AI from mere computation towards something reminiscent of epistemology. The history is not a straight line but a braided tradition. On one strand there is symbolic AI, often called GOFAI, which attempted to encode the structures of knowledge, facts, rules, predicates into machines. On another strand there is connectionism, the intuition that learning might emerge from networks of simple units, each following local rules. Learning by adjusting connections in much the way neurons adjust their synapses. The attraction of both paths is obvious. If knowledge can be represented as rules, we might reason about it, justify decisions, and trace explanations. If knowledge can be learned as patterns of activation, the machine might generalize from data, adapt to new tasks, and discover representations no human designer could anticipate. The tension between these strands is not just technical, it is deeply epistemological. How does a system come to know something about the world? What does it mean for a system to understand? as opposed to merely to process? And how should we relate to an agent whose knowledge is probabilistic, statistical, and shaped by the structure of its training data? The best way to address such questions is to walk through a framework that philosophers have found both clarifying and provocative: Marr's levels of analysis. David Marr proposed 3 levels at which an intelligent system can be understood. First, the computational level, the what and why. What problem is the system solving in abstract terms, and why is that problem posed in the way it is? Second, the algorithmic level, the how. What representations and procedures transform input into output? Third, the implementational level, the physical substrate. How are these representations and computations realized in hardware or software? When we bring AI into Marr's framework, something becomes visible that is easy to miss when we focus on performance alone. Consider ImageNet classification. At the computational level, the question is clear, given a photo. What task is the system performing and what objective is it pursuing? The object is to assign a label that matches a human annotated category, often with remarkable accuracy. At the algorithmic level, the method is a hierarchy of features, learned representations, and decision rules, convolutional nets that progressively transform pixels into abstract concepts like dog or car. And at the implementational level, we find the thousands, sometimes millions, of floating-point calculations performed on GPUs, the software frameworks, the optimization routines, and the training protocols that shape the network's weights. The beauty and the danger of Marr's triad is that it invites us to examine epistemic commitments at multiple depths: what counts as knowledge, what justifies it, and what could possibly ground it in something like experience. The Bayesian thread, probabilistic reasoning, often slides most neatly into the Marr framework at the algorithmic level. Especially in contemporary AI, Bayesian approaches propose that knowledge is not a single true statement about the world but a structured set of beliefs with degrees of confidence, updated as evidence accumulates. In practice, Bayesian networks, probabilistic programming, and more recently large-scale probabilistic models give us a mathematical vocabulary for uncertainty, prior knowledge, and learning from incomplete data. This probabilistic lens helps to explain why modern AI with self-supervised and unsupervised learning can work so well, by modeling uncertainty, by predicting what data should look like, and by continually updating beliefs as new data arrive. A system can acquire a functional, if not richly human, form of knowledge. It is a theory of inference as much as a theory of representation. To connect this to the real world, let us turn to 3 emblematic examples that you may have heard about in popular AI discourse: ImageNet classification, GPT-3, and GPT-4 language capabilities, and AlphaFold's protein structure predictions. Each of these is a milestone that prompts questions about what counts as knowledge, what counts as understanding, and how we interpret a machine's abilities in epistemic terms. ImageNet classification, a benchmark that catalyzed the deep learning era, demonstrated that a machine could learn to recognize hundreds of thousands of categories from vast labeled datasets. The success is not merely technical, it is epistemic in flavor. The system learns a mapping from complex visual input to a label with high accuracy and broad generalization across images scraped from the web. Yet the question remains, what does the system know when it labels an image as a dog? Is that knowledge simply the statistical correlation between pixels and a category in the training data? Or does it reflect a structured understanding of what dog-like features are? How dogs relate to dogs and how those features relate to human categories? The answer sits somewhere in between. And that is precisely where epistemology becomes tangible. The model has learned a representation that supports a decision. The justification for that decision is not the same sort of justification a human would adduce. We can write explanations. We can generate saliency maps. We can discuss the learned features, but the underlying truth conditions of those labels, do they capture the essence of dog in any robust sense, are contested. In the world of language, GPT-3 and GPT-4 push this boundary even further. These systems generate text that often reads as coherent, context-aware, and sometimes surprisingly insightful. They can summarize complex material, produce code, compose poetry, simulate dialogue, and even reason through multi-step tasks. From a Marian perspective, these models operate at all 3 levels simultaneously. At the computational level, they aim to produce plausible text given a prompt. At the algorithmic level, they encode monstrous high-dimensional representations of language and world knowledge. At the implementational level, they run on petaflop-scale hardware, with careful training regimens and optimization techniques. When we ask what they know, the answer must be nuanced. They have learned statistical patterns that allow them to predict the next word in a sequence, or the continuation of a narrative or the answer to a question with striking reliability. But knowledge in the human sense, grounded, justified, conscious. Experiential knowledge remains disputed. AlphaFold offers perhaps the most startling demonstration of knowledge on a molecular scale. It predicts protein structures with remarkable accuracy, enabling insights into biology that previously required long, expensive experimentation. If a machine can predict the three-dimensional arrangement of amino acids from a sequence, is that not a form of knowledge about the material world? It is knowledge codified in an internal representation, but is it knowledge in the sense that a scientist possesses it when she reasons about a protein's fold, its function, or its interaction with other molecules? The epistemic stakes here are intimate with the philosophy of science. How do we justify claims about the natural world when the justification rests in the outputs of an opaque engine that learned from data rather than from first principles? The AlphaFold achievement invites us to reconsider the role of theory versus data in knowledge production. It is not nostalgia for a theory-laden scientist that we must recover, but a new realism about what counts as a robust, testable model of nature, whether the model is a handcrafted theory, a probabilistic inference, or a learned representation that encodes structural regularities of biology. Advancing beyond these concrete examples, we must address an enduring preoccupation. How do inductive biases shape learning and interpretability? Inductive biases are the priors, the architectural choices, the training objectives, the data selection processes that steer how a model learns. They are not mere technicalities, they are epistemic commitments about how we think knowledge should be formed. In AI, inductive biases are built into network architectures, convolutional layers that assume locality and translation invariance in vision, attention mechanisms that assume dependencies can be long-range and context-driven in language. They are built into training regimes, self-supervision, masked language modeling, contrastive learning, each embedding a theory about the kinds of patterns data will exhibit, the ways in which signals should be extracted, and what it means to generalize. Biases also manifest in interpretability. A model trained to optimize a particular objective often yields representations that are optimized for performance rather than human understandability. The result can be attention, a system that is remarkably capable yet opaque to human oversight. Here the tie to epistemology is explicit. Do we demand interpretability because we want to know the justification behind a decision? Or do we seek interpretability because we want to align the system with human values and shared norms? The answer informs how we think of knowledge and understanding in AI. We can have powerful models that perform extremely well, but their internal reasons may be inscrutable, and their knowledge may be distributed across layers, weights, and training data in ways we cannot easily justify to a human observer. If we press deeper on the notion of understanding versus processing, we encounter a central frame of debate in both philosophy and cognitive science. Processing is a functional matter. A system inputs something, applies rules or learned mappings, and outputs a result. Understanding, by contrast, carries a normative and experiential weight. It implies grasp, intentional content, and a form of justification in reasoning that can be communicated and defended to others. In AI, the line between these can blur. A system may produce a correct inference for reasons that are opaque to us, yet do not appear to harbor the kind of understanding a human would claim. This leads to two intertwined threads of critique: the Chinese room argument and the symbol grounding problem. The Chinese room, introduced by John Searle in 1980, is a lucid challenge to the claim that symbolic manipulation alone suffices for understanding. In Searle's thought experiment, a person who does not know Chinese sits in a room with a rule book for manipulating Chinese characters. The person can produce correct Chinese responses to inputs. Yet Searle asks us to consider whether the person truly understands Chinese. The broader claim he makes is that a program, an entity executing a formal set of rules that map inputs to outputs, could appear to understand Chinese while lacking any grasp of its meaning. The argument pushes back against the idea that syntax alone suffices for semantic understanding. In Searle's terms, a program is not a mind, not a brain, not a system with intentionality. The implication for AI epistemology is stark. If current statistical systems and symbol processing engines can mimic understanding without genuine intentional content, then what does knowledge amount to in such systems? Nagel's well-known meditation, "What is it like to be a bat?" adds a further philosophical layer. Nagel writes with a sharp elegy for subjective experience. There's something it is like to be an organism that has a particular point of view on the world. To know what it is like to be a bat is not to know all the facts about bats from the outside, but to apprehend a first-person perspective that cannot be captured by objective, third-person description alone. In AI terms, this raises the possibility that a machine's knowledge, however vast in data and inference, may lack the subjective vantage that characterizes conscious experience. The epistemic import is not merely about the possibility of conscious machines. It is about the scope and limits of objective knowledge and whether it can ever fully capture the richness of the phenomenology that accompanies cognitive life. From these two counterarguments, the Chinese Room and Nagel's insistence on the subjective character of experience, emerge two further lines of inquiry. One asks whether current statistical learning systems genuinely know what they represent, or whether their success is a sophisticated form of pattern completion whose justification lies in performance rather than truth. The other invites consideration of embodiment. Does cognition require a body, a sensory-motor history, a history of acting in the world to generate genuine understanding? The symbol grounding problem, introduced by Stephen Harned in 1990, asks exactly this. How can symbols be given meaning in a system that only manipulates symbols without any intrinsic meaning attached to those symbols? If a language model sees words as tokens, learns associations among them, and can talk about objects and events, where does the actual grounding of those symbols in the world occur? The classic worry is that the model's semantics are emergent from correlation in large corpora rather than tied to direct grounding in perceptual and motor experience. In Harned's formulation, the symbol grounding problem highlights a potential epistemic shortcoming of machine understanding. There is a difference between manipulating signs and knowing what those signs refer to in a lived world. In this light, the argument about knowledge in AI becomes deeply intertwined with the philosophy of science and cognitive science. Knowledge requires justification, reliability, and sometimes an explanation that aligns with human cognitive models. Some philosophers of science have argued that even well-supported AI claims to knowledge are provisional and theory-laden, dependent on the frameworks we adopt for inference and explanation. Karl Popper's emphasis on bold conjectures and falsification resonates here. An AI system's knowledge claims must be exposed to potential refutation and testing against real-world data. Others, such as Thomas Kuhn, remind us that scientific progress unfolds in paradigms. The rise of deep learning might be understood as a paradigm shift that reframes problems of representation, learning, and explanation even if it does not deliver a theory in the traditional sense. Cognitive science, meanwhile, asks us to consider whether the architectures and learning rules used by AI are aligned with human cognitive architectures, or if they chart a distinctly different path to knowledge, with its own forms of justification. The tradition of epistemology in AI also engages with a historical thread about how we come to know the world through machines, from the early days of symbolic reasoning to the modern explosion of data-driven models. The perceptron era, inaugurated by Frank Rosenblatt in 1958, is a crucial turning point in this story. The perceptron was a simple neural unit, designed to learn a linearly separable decision boundary from input patterns. It promised a kind of machine learning that could discover structure without explicit human-crafted rules. The perceptron was celebrated for a time as a stepping stone toward autonomous learning. Rosenblatt described this machine as capable of learning from examples, adjusting its weights to minimize error, and thereby acquiring knowledge about how to separate inputs into categories. Yet the excitement of the perceptron era met a stern critique from Minsky and Papert. In their 1969 book, Perceptrons, they demonstrated fundamental limitations of single-layer perceptrons, most famously their inability to learn the XOR function, a task that required nonlinearity and a form of representation beyond a single layer. The lesson was stark, simple. Local learning rules can be powerful but insufficient for broad intelligence. They warned that a purely bottom-up, stimulus-driven approach would struggle to capture the complexity of the world. The book's critique helped trigger a period of diminished interest in neural networks, a lull often dubbed the AI winter. The historical anecdote matters because it reminds us that epistemic progress in AI is not linear. It proceeds in cycles of possibility and constraint, breakthroughs and retractions, all of which are themselves epistemic events that shape how we understand knowledge and learning. The backpropagation revolution of 1986, pushed into prominence by Rumelhart, Hinton, and Williams, reinvigorated the neural network project and opened a path toward modern deep learning. Backpropagation offered a practical method to train multi-layer networks by propagating error signals backward through the network. adjusting weights to minimize a chosen loss function. The phrase backpropagation of errors captures the essence of this methodological turn. Errors are not merely tolerated, they are used to refine internal representations. In their influential paper, they wrote that training a multi-layer network with backpropagation could yield internal representations capable of complex tasks, a claim that would prove prescient as deep learning grew into a dominant paradigm. The human mind, by analogy, learns by adjusting internal states in response to feedback from the world. And the backpropagation algorithm provided a computational analog for this insight. While the metaphor has its limits, machines do not literally learn as humans learn. Backpropagation offered a robust framework for shaping learning processes and, with it, a new sense that the knowledge captured in layers of weights can generalize beyond the training data. From the backpropagation era to the present, we watched a surge of deep learning, culminating in the 2010s and beyond. With architectures capable of astonishing feats, the ascent of large language models trained on vast corpora of text transformed what counts as knowledge in AI. These models demonstrate a new form of statistical learning. Knowledge is a pattern of associations, a probability distribution over the next token, a representation that captures distributional regularities across language, culture, and world knowledge. They are not simply memorizing phrases. In many cases, they interpolate and extrapolate in sophisticated ways, simulating reasoning and planning to a degree that invites awe and concern in roughly equal measure. And then AlphaFold entered the stage, altering biology in a way that no prior AI technology had. The protein structure predictions produced by AlphaFold exhibit remarkable accuracy and, in the eyes of many scientists, a new level of epistemic reliability in biology. If a model can predict a protein's structure from its amino acid sequence with near atomic precision, what does that mean for knowledge in science? It demonstrates that a computational system can generate predictive, testable models that align with experimental realities, accelerating discovery and offering a new standard for what counts as reliable knowledge in a scientific domain. Alongside these concrete advances, there is a robust conversation about the role of self-supervised learning and other unsupervised or semi-supervised strategies. Self-supervised learning seeks to learn from the data itself, without requiring exhaustive labeling. The idea is to exploit structure in data to form robust representations that can be transferred to downstream tasks with minimal supervision. This is epistemically attractive for several reasons. It mirrors, to some extent, how humans learn from a world that reveals patterns without always labeling every moment. It also invites questions about the nature of the representations learned, whether they capture causal structure, intuitive physics, or social semantics, and whether those representations allow for truly generalizable knowledge or are biased by the distribution of data seen during training. We must not overlook the role of cross-disciplinary cross-references in shaping epistemology in AI. The conversation reverberates through philosophy of science, cognitive science, and epistemology itself. If we take epistemology seriously as the study of how we know, AI invites us to rethink knowledge as a form of representational adequacy under uncertainty, justified by predictive success, and constrained by the architecture of learning. The philosophy of science asks about the status of models that function well across domains. Are they true theories in the sense of capturing underlying structure? Or are they instrumentally effective approximations that work within a regime of data and tasks? Cognitive science encourages us to consider whether AI models truly instantiate cognitive states, beliefs, desires, intentions, or whether they operate with a distinct kind of belief that is better described as probabilistic inference in high-dimensional spaces. Let us now pivot to two intertwined themes that ground the epistemology of AI in practical, lived terms: understanding versus processing, and the shaping influence of inductive biases on learning and interpretability. The distinction rests on a subtle but important axis. To process is to transform input into output according to learned rules, often without a meaningful tie to human concepts or experiences. To understand in a robust sense would mean not only producing correct outputs, but having a grasp of why those outputs matter, how they fit into a coherent framework of beliefs, and the ability to justify them in ways that align with human rationality and shared norms. In AI systems today, we often see systems that excel at processing, matching patterns, predicting sentences, solving tasks, without demonstrating understanding in a way that satisfies our epistemic criteria. This is not a mere philosophical concern. It affects how we evaluate reliability, trust, And safety, inductive biases, those prior assumptions built into models and training protocols, shape both what AI learns and how easily we can interpret what it learns. Inductive biases function as the scaffolding through which data becomes knowledge. If you design a network with a particular architecture, you embed assumptions about locality, symmetry, temporal structure, or relational reasoning. If you choose a learning objective that emphasizes reconstruction or next token prediction, you embed an expectation about how knowledge should be organized and updated. These biases influence generalization. Will the system apply what it has learned to new, slightly different tasks? Will it perform robustly when data shifts? And crucially for interpretability, will we be able to say what the model's representations mean? Or will they remain opaque hidden layers of numbers? Interpretability in this sense is not just a technical nicety, it is an epistemic virtue. If we want AI to contribute to human knowledge, to be used within domains that demand justification and accountability, we need to be able to trace why a model arrived at a particular conclusion, what features it relied upon, and how confident it is in its claims. Inductive biases may help or hinder this goal, a strong bias toward disentangled, human understandable representations can yield interpretable models but may limit expressive power and performance. A weaker bias toward in-task optimization can produce extraordinary performance but at the cost of interpretability. The philosophical challenge is not merely technical. What kinds of explanations do we require from AI? What counts as a legitimate justification for machine-derived knowledge? And can we design systems whose internal workings align with human epistemic expectations while retaining robust performance? To ground these developments in concrete counterarguments, it is instructive to revisit the two central lines of critique that ground the debate in philosophy. The first is the traditional Chinese room. Even if a machine convincingly produces correct symbols, does it truly understand? The second is the symbol grounding problem. How do symbols acquire meaning if they are simply manipulated according to rules, with no anchor to sensory experience or causal contact with the world? If a language model can generate plausible explanations about the world, does it truly know the world? Or is it merely predicting what text should follow given a prompt? The worry is that symbolic manipulation, even in large-scale forms, may be insufficient for genuine understanding. It may yield impressive performance while lacking the kind of semantic grounding necessary for robust knowledge across contexts. A second set of debates asks whether current statistical learning systems actually know what they represent. Do these systems possess belief-like states? Can they be said to know that a sentence is grammatically correct, or that a protein sequence will likely fold in a given way, with a justification that can be provided to humans? Some philosophers and scientists argue that knowledge requires a form of conscious awareness or intentionality that systematizes justification in human terms. Others contend that knowledge can be understood as a form of reliable representation that tracks the world, even if it is not conscious in the human sense. The discussion is ongoing, and it matters for policy, for the design of AI systems, and for our own self-understanding as human knowers who depend on machine-assisted inquiry. Embodiment adds another intriguing dimension to the discussion. Some theorists argue that cognition is inseparable from the body and the ability to act in the world. Perception, action, and environment continually shape understanding. If this is true, then disembodied AI, systems that never interact with the world through sensors and motors, may always stand at a remove from genuine understanding. The debate about embodiment is not purely philosophical. It has practical consequences for how we design AI that learns from interacting with humans and the physical world, how we interpret models that learn from virtual environments, and how we assess their reliability in real-world tasks. This brings us to a set of historical anecdotes that illuminate the arc of epistemology in AI, showing how the field's self-understanding has shifted as technical capabilities evolved. The perceptron era of 1958 began with a wave of optimism that a simple unit could learn to classify inputs by adjusting weights in response to errors. It captured the imagination of scientists and the public alike, a machine that could learn from examples, a machine that could begin to acquire knowledge on its own. The early enthusiasm, however, met a critique that could not be ignored. Minsky and Papert, in their 1969 book Perceptrons, pointed to fundamental limitations of single-layer perceptrons, most famously their inability to learn the XOR function, a nonlinearly separable problem. Their skeptical verdict, summarizing a core epistemic concern about the sufficiency of minimalist learning rules, helped slow the field. The The perceptron era thus becomes emblematic of how theoretical constraints shape what counts as possible knowledge in AI. At least for a time, then came the backpropagation revolution of 1986. Rumelhart, Hinton, and Williams showed that by propagating error signals backward through a multi-layer network, learning could produce useful internal representations and powerful generalization capabilities. The phrase they popularized, backpropagation, became a catchword for the idea that learning could be hierarchical, that a system could build progressively more abstract concepts that support more complex reasoning. The shift was not merely a technical trick, it was a reimagining of how machines could acquire knowledge. With backpropagation, deeper networks could learn, not merely memorize. They could discover structured representations, enabling tasks that previously seemed out of reach. The historical anecdote then continues with the deep learning surge of the 2010s, which brought in architectures that could scale with data, compute, and clever training regimens. It was a reascent of neural networks, but with a new maturity. Techniques like batch normalization, residual connections, and large-scale unsupervised pre-training made possible what earlier generations could only dream of. The ascent of large language models and the breakthroughs in protein folding predictions then marked a new era of AI epistemology. Language models demonstrated that the statistical structure of language could be captured at scale, producing outputs that are not only fluent but capable of reasoning-like behaviors, planning, and generalization across a wide range of tasks. The knowledge embedded in these models is distributed across massive parameter spaces and training corpora. It invites epistemic humility because it challenges our traditional sense of how knowledge is generated and validated. Protein folding, driven by AlphaFold, showed that an AI system could produce predictions that align closely with experimental truths, a kind of knowledge about the physical structure of matter that has immediate consequences for biology, chemistry, and medicine. These achievements force us to re-examine what counts as robust knowledge. Is it predictive success across tests, alignment with empirical observation, or the capacity to generate new hypotheses and guide experiments? As we move through this history, we should keep returning to the question of cross-references to epistemology, philosophy of science, and cognitive science. In epistemology, the core worry, can we justify knowledge claims in AI, is central. In philosophy of science, the status of AI-generated models as explanatory theories or as instrumental tools raises essential questions about the nature of scientific explanation, causation, and the role of machine-generated insights in human inquiry. In cognitive science, we wonder whether AI systems are mere simulacra of cognitive processes or whether they reveal new principles about representation, learning, and the architecture of intelligence. These cross-references are not mere footnotes, they are essential to a mature account of AI knowledge. Indeed, one could imagine a thought experiment. Consider a future AI that can autonomously formulate hypotheses about a domain, test them against data, revise its models, and communicate its reasoning to humans with a level of transparency and justification that is legible to domain experts. If such a system existed, would its knowledge be counted as genuine by human epistemic standards? If the system could demonstrate consistent predictive accuracy, robust generalization, and coherent explanations, would we still insist that human-like intentionality and consciousness are prerequisites for knowledge? These questions do not have easy answers, but they illuminate the heart of the matter. Epistemology in AI is not an add-on to technology. It is the central question about what AI models know, how they know it, and what we owe to the knowledge they generate. Let us incorporate a few more guiding reflections, with a view toward real-world implications. Consider the tension between the impressive performance of AI on tasks such as image classification, language generation, and protein folding, and the persistent questions about interpretation, justification, and grounding. The fact that a model can identify a dog in a million images or predict the structure of a protein with near-atomic precision does not automatically endow it with the kinds of epistemic attributes that humans prize: understanding, intentional explanation, or a robust sense of justification that would stand up to critical scrutiny in the face of new data or alternative theories. Yet the same technological achievements push us to broaden the concept of knowledge. They force us to rethink the boundaries between mere correlations and explanations, between pattern recognition and causal understanding, between predictive accuracy and explanatory virtue. To help connect these ideas to practical wisdom, I want to foreground a few concrete cross-references to other thinkers and ideas that illuminate the landscape. First, A nod to the philosophy of science. Karl Popper's emphasis on falsifiability as a criterion of scientific knowledge invites us to test AI models against hard null hypotheses and to view failures as opportunities for learning rather than as denials of progress. Second, Thomas Kuhn's notion of paradigm shifts helps us see the AI revolution as part of a broader story about how scientific communities reorganize their methods, standards, and explanations in response to powerful new tools. Third, Hilary Putnam's idea of natural kinds and semantic externalism reminds us that meaning is often tied to the surrounding world and to how a system interacts with it, an important caution for purely statistical, data-driven knowledge claims. Fourth, Fred Dretske and others in the information theoretic tradition push us to ask what it means for a representation to carry information about the world, and when such information counts as meaning rather than mere correlation. Finally, cognitive science provides a bridge between machine learning and human cognition, encouraging us to examine how human knowledge is constructed, justified and learned, and how those processes compare to machine learning pipelines. As we conclude this segment, let us return to a few central questions and invite you to reflect on them as you watch the rest of this video and engage with the material in your own work or studies. What counts as knowledge in AI? And how do we justify it? Is statistical learning, with its large-scale pattern discovery, a sufficient basis for knowledge, or do we need grounding in embodied experience to claim genuine understanding? Can architecture, data, and objective functions be designed in such a way that the AI's knowledge becomes interpretable, explainable, and aligned with human values? And how should we balance the impressive epistemic achievements of today's AI with the deep philosophical questions about mind, meaning, and embodiment? Let me offer some guided closing thoughts, not as a final word but as an invitation to ongoing inquiry. First, the story of AI epistemology is a story of progress and constraint, triumphs like ImageNet, GPT-3/4, and AlphaFold reveal the extraordinary potential of data-driven learning while inviting careful scrutiny about grounding, justification, and interpretation. Second, the arguments about understanding versus processing are not merely abstract. They shape how we design, deploy, and regulate AI systems. If we want AI to be integrated into science, medicine, and public life as a trusted partner, we must attend to the epistemic conditions under which knowledge is produced, validated, and communicated. Third, the history of AI, its milestones, and its missteps remains a powerful guide. The perceptron's early promise, Minsky and Papert's critique, the backpropagation revolution, and the current era of scalable, pre-trained models together offer a narrative about how knowledge evolves in a field that is both technical and deeply human. We can close with a touch of historical texture, a reminder that the questions we raise are not new but ancient in form. As Alan Turing observed, the question that matters is whether we can know the mind behind the machine. The Chinese Room asks us to distinguish between function and meaning. Nagel asks us to attend to the subjective side of experience. The symbol grounding problem asks us to ground meaning in the world we inhabit. The history of AI's epistemology, with its episodes of genius, critique, and reinvention, remains a conversation, not a verdict, to ground the discussion in the present moment. Let us end with a few lines that cycle back to the real work of this field. If we want AI to contribute to knowledge in a way that remains intelligible and ethically responsible, we must cultivate systems whose learning processes are not just powerful but transparent, whose representations connect to human concepts and experiences, and whose decision-making can be justified in terms that make sense to scientists, clinicians, engineers, and citizens alike. We need to be honest about the limits of current systems, about where grounding is plausible, and about where embodiment might matter. And we should remember that the goal of epistemology is not merely to rank AI on a ladder of competence, but to understand what kinds of knowing a machine can do, what it means for humans to rely on such knowing, and how we can build a future where machine knowledge and human knowledge illuminate one another in a shared pursuit of understanding. The dialogue across centuries of thought, from Turing's bold predictions to Searle's thought experiments, from Harned's symbol grounding to the empirical triumphs of AlphaFold and GPT models, remains our best compass for navigating the philosophical terrain of AI. It is a terrain not of certainty, but of careful inquiry, where the questions we ask about knowledge, justification, and understanding shape how we create and relate to the machines that increasingly participate in the work of knowing. And so the conversation continues with new models, new data, new benchmarks, and new theoretical questions that will demand ever sharper attention to the epistemology of artificial intelligence. The future we imagine for artificial intelligence is not merely a landscape of faster processors and clever pattern matching. It is a moral landscape, a political landscape, and a practical landscape braided together. When we speak of future trajectories, alignment, risks, and harmony with humans, we are really asking, how do we want the conversation between human purposes and machine capabilities to unfold? Do we want a partnership whose goals we can reliably understand, guide, and revise as we learn more about ourselves, or do we accept a world where the machine's own emergent priorities begin to steer us without our full comprehension? The questions are not technical only, they are about governance, values, and the kind of civilization we intend to cultivate. And because this topic threads through ethics, political philosophy, international law, technology studies, and environmental and social implications, the discussion has to be as multi-layered as the systems we are building. To begin, we should be clear about what we mean by alignment. The phrase points toward a simple but deep problem. How do we ensure that a system whose capabilities may vastly surpass our own ends up pursuing goals that reflect our values, or at least do not cause harm in ways we cannot foresee? The problem divides into subproblems: how to specify values that a machine can act upon, how to ensure robustness so that small deviations in the environment do not cascade into large misbehaviors, how to maintain corrigibility, so that a future system remains open to human oversight rather than becoming an uninterruptible dictator of goals, and how to govern the deployment of such systems so that distributed incentives across firms, states, and civil society produce outcomes that reflect plural perspectives rather than a single, privileged blueprint. These questions sit at the intersection of algorithmic design and moral theory. They also require thinking about what counts as a stakeholder, whose voices matter when we weigh risks and benefits, and how to balance efficiency with fairness, precaution with experimentation, innovation with responsibility. The origins of this conversation matter because they show how quickly a field can shift from a speculative ideal to a practical, policy-relevant enterprise. In 1956, the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence launched a moment in which a small group of researchers claimed that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. That sentence, carved into the stone of history, marks the moment when a community began to treat intelligence not as something sacred that humans uniquely own, but as a design problem that can be solved step by step. The exact proposal stated, in one of its most famous lines, that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. This is not simply a technical claim. It is an invitation to reframe human capacities as a set of functions that, in principle, can be encoded, learned, refined, and managed. The omen is double-edged. The aspiration to replicate or exceed human reasoning is inseparable from the responsibility to shape what such replication means for the rest of society. From those early days, a lineage of thinkers shaped the terms of the debate. John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, Nathaniel Rochester, and their colleagues asked not just whether machines could be built, but what it would mean if they were allowed to do things we once reserved for people. They stirred a debate about whether intelligence is a property of a physical substrate or a more abstract capacity that could be realized in multiple forms. Later, as the field grew, figures such as Norbert Wiener, Joseph Weizenbaum, and later Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig clarified the practical stakes of alignment and control. They reminded us that capability without restraint can be dangerous, but restraint without capability can leave us with fragile, brittle systems that cannot navigate the real world. The tension between prowess and prudence became a through line in the story of AI. One thread in this history runs through what we now call the alignment problem: how to align a machine's goals with human values in a world of diverse and sometimes conflicting purposes. Another thread concerns the control problem. If a system becomes more capable than its designers, how do we ensure we can understand, direct, or limit its behavior without falling prey to unintended consequences? These concerns were not abstract, they have real political and legal implications. When a system helps route traffic, makes medical decisions, or manages critical infrastructure, the stakes shift from theoretical risk to tangible risk. Lives hung in the balance, livelihoods at stake, and cultural choices about what kind of future we invite into being. To make sense of the present and to imagine credible futures, We must also reckon with the arguments that alignment is not only possible, but robust enough to guide our ongoing development. There are voices that insist progress will be gradual and manageable with robust safeguards, that continued improvements can be tethered to clear oversight mechanisms, and that the risk of catastrophe will be contained by incremental testing, transparent reporting, and diverse governance experiments. The intuition here is that translatable incremental steps, alongside strong norms, safety reviews, independent verification, and international collaboration, can give societies time to adapt. If we treat this as a problem of engineering discipline with a moral lexicon rather than a sudden leap into the unknown, then it becomes plausible to imagine a future in which AI grows more capable but remains under human direction, thanks to layered oversight and designed-in constraints. On the other hand, there are formidable counterarguments. One claims that alignment and coordination will be far harder than any observer anticipates. The incentive structures in a global environment where companies chase profit, nations pursue security interests, and researchers race to publish or deploy may resist the patience and humility required for alignment. The problem of incentive misalignment could intensify as capabilities scale. Misaligned objectives could produce misaligned outcomes even when each actor believes they are acting in good faith. Another counterargument is that AI will primarily augment human decision-making rather than replace it, at least in the foreseeable future, thereby reducing existential risk by making human oversight more, not less, essential. Yet even this augmentation could create new layers of dependence, new forms of coercion or bias in data and decision processes, and new vulnerabilities that could be exploited or amplified by adversaries. There is no simple linear path here. The future may involve stages, assistance, augmentation, automation, and perhaps something beyond, that each require distinct governance and safety regimes. A core area of discussion, then, is how we can actually pursue value alignment in practice. It is not enough to declare that we want to align AI with human values. We must specify what values we mean, how we aggregate them in a plural world, and how to test whether a system's behavior reflects them across different contexts. Various strategies have been proposed and debated. One is scalable oversight, the idea that we can supervise the behavior of increasingly capable systems by building oversight mechanisms that scale with the system, using methods such as progressive disclosure, human-in-the-loop evaluation, and hierarchical governance where humans set high-level goals and the system interprets them for day-to-day operation. Another strategy is interpretability and explainability, the hope that we can peer into the decision procedures of a model and understand why it chose a certain action or output, which in turn informs whether to accept, modify, or reject its goals. A third strategy is value learning, the attempt to derive human values from data, demonstrations, or natural language and to embed those values in the objective function guiding the system's behavior. A fourth is corrigibility, the design of systems that remain open to human intervention, even when they're more capable than we are comfortable with, so that we can guide their development rather than being guided by them. Yet all these strategies must be situated within a broader governance framework that reflects plural perspectives. The real world does not speak with a single voice, it speaks with many. Pluralism in values means that legitimate governance must accommodate divergent moral intuitions, cultural norms, and political commitments. This is where international law and cross-border governance become essential. The movement toward alignment cannot be the property of a single nation or a single corporation. It must be a shared project, subject to accountability, transparency, and checks and balances that can withstand political changes and strategic misgivings. The EU AI Act, in particular, stands as a landmark attempt to put guardrails around high-risk AI applications, requiring risk assessments, data governance, conformity assessments, and ongoing monitoring. It signals a shift from a purely technical competition to a governance competition in which the questions of safety, fairness, and accountability become central to market access and regulatory legitimacy. National policy initiatives in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and other democracies are trying to mirror this logic in varied forms, balancing the speed of innovation with the protections demanded by citizens and civil society. The rhetoric of values-based governance is not merely cosmetic. It is an attempt to anchor AI development in shared norms that can be understood, negotiated, and revised in light of new evidence and new forms of risk. We should also talk about the idea of coevolution between humans and machines. This is a productive metaphor if we treat it as a process rather than a forecast of inevitability. Coevolution suggests that as AI systems become more capable, human institutions, social practices, and ethical theories adapt in response. The feedback loop runs both ways. As algorithms optimize for certain objectives, they shape human behavior and social structures, and as social institutions redesign incentives, calibration, and governance, they steer the direction of AI research. This cross-pollination means we need to study the social dimensions of AI not as add-ons, but as integral to the core technical project. It invites collaboration between ethicists and engineers, sociologists and policymakers, environmentalists and data scientists. It invites a kind of reflexivity about our own values, about which values we will privilege in our governance mechanisms, and about how to ensure that the long arc of technological progress leads toward flourishing rather than domination. To bring some concreteness to these reflections, consider the real-world applications that already illustrate how alignment theory meets practice. In transportation, autonomous systems promise to reduce accidents, optimize traffic, and reshape urban design, but they also pose questions about accountability in mixed traffic environments. Who bears responsibility when a self-driving car fails, or when its decisions disproportionately affect marginalized communities? In medicine, AI-assisted diagnostics and decision-making can expand access to high-quality care, but they require careful oversight of data provenance, interpretability for clinicians and patients, and safeguards against biases that could exacerbate health disparities. In both domains, safety-focused research programs have become essential. Research centers and labs increasingly pursue safety by design, robust verification, adversarial testing, and the study of failure modes. Projects in fairness, accountability, transparency, and interpretability, the FAT/AI agenda, are not decorative. They are central to the trust that society must have in these systems if they are to be deployed widely and responsibly. As a global framework for governance and responsibility, the EU AI Act offers a concrete model for how values and plural perspectives can be embedded in law and policy. The Act emphasizes risk-based regulation, transparency requirements for high-risk systems, and specific duties for providers and users to ensure safety, accountability, and human oversight. It is complemented by national policy initiatives in the United States, by the National AI Initiative Act and related funding for safety, transparency, and ethical research in other regions, by similar programs aimed at balancing innovation with social protections. These regulatory efforts do not erase the moral questions AI raises, they operationalize some of the answers. They force institutions to articulate the values that matter to them, to justify the trade-offs involved in deploying powerful systems, and to establish mechanisms, such as independent auditing, public reporting, and recourse for harmed individuals, through which people can hold developers and users of AI accountable. In medicine and transportation, there are vivid examples that illuminate both the promise and the tension of alignment. Autonomous delivery and logistics systems can reduce costs, increase speed, and free human workers to engage in more creative work. Yet the deployment of such systems must be accompanied by rigorous safety standards, continuous human oversight in critical contexts, and the protection of workers' rights as automation intensifies. In medicine, AI can assist with imaging, triage, and personalized treatment plans, potentially extending life and reducing suffering. But once again, we confront the problem of data governance, patient privacy, and the risk that bias in training data translates into misdiagnosis or unequal treatment. These are not hypothetical issues. They are lived realities that require careful policy design, robust technical safeguards, and ongoing public dialogue about how much risk is acceptable in pursuit of greater benefits. To understand what can go wrong and why many voices insist on caution, we should remember two powerful counterarguments with historical anchors in their best moments. The first is the claim that progress will be gradual and manageable with robust safeguards. The intuition here is that AI systems will evolve like other transformative technologies, through iterative improvements, incremental regulatory learning, and a broad consensus about safety norms. The second counterargument points to the limits of coordination, even with the best intentions. Global coordination around AI safety may struggle under differing national interests, corporate incentives, and unequal capacities to implement safeguards. Add to those concerns the possibility that alignment efforts could be hampered by misaligned incentives, by information asymmetries, and by the difficulty of measuring success when the system's behavior can be robust in one domain and fragile in another. A third related counterargument, sometimes invoked in debates about the near-term future, is that AI will primarily augment human decision-making rather than supplant it, thereby reducing existential risk. But augmentation changes the pressure points. It can concentrate decision power in systems that are increasingly capable and opaque, potentially widening the gap between what we think we have controlled and what we have actually given over to automation. These arguments draw strength from both empirical observation and theoretical reflection. The history of AI safety research has shown that careful design, modular verification, and layered oversight can dramatically reduce the probability of catastrophic failure in controlled contexts. Programs dedicated to safety, security, and alignment, such as research initiatives in academia, industry safety teams within major labs, and philanthropic funding for foundational questions about AI governance, reflect a shared belief that it is prudent to invest now in problems whose consequences would be difficult to reverse. The logic is not to fear every possible hazard, but to invest in a disciplined framework for testing, auditing, and revising AI systems as they become more capable. This is not a guarantee of safety. It is a posture of humility and precaution that acknowledges how little we know about long-term trajectories while still acting to reduce risk. The anecdotal history surrounding these debates offers illuminating context. Consider the 2019 GPT-2 release policy. OpenAI, faced with a fear of potential misuse, for example, the generation of persuasive disinformation, spam, or impersonation, opted for a staged release rather than a full public disclosure. Their blog stated, "We will not release the full GPT-2 model to the public at this time." The choice was blunt. It signaled a willingness to impose precautionary restraints in the face of uncertain harm, while also signaling that the team would monitor the landscape and adjust as understanding deepened. This move catalyzed a broader conversation about how to balance openness and safety, a debate that continues in every major AI project. It also catalyzed breakthroughs as researchers found ways to improve performance even as the publicly released model remained constrained. The policy didn't end the risk. It reframed it as a policy question in which technical progress and governance must advance together. Another anchor of the narrative is the Dartmouth Conference itself. The origin story is not just a historical footnote. It is a reminder of the optimism and the ambition that framed AI as a field that could be steered deliberately. The proposal's central claim that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it was not merely a thesis about computation. It was a visionary pledge that the design of intelligent systems could be disciplined enough to reflect human intentions. That pledge has carried through into current debates about alignment. Can we describe enough of human values and contexts to build systems that do not drift into misaligned behavior when operating in the real world? The pursuit of that answer remains a defining challenge for our era, one that invites both technical ingenuity and ethical imagination. We can also listen to the warnings that have circulated over the decades. Prominent thinkers have warned that unbridled pursuit of capability could outpace our ability to steer. The most famous of these warnings comes from Stephen Hawking, who warned that the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. The word end here is not literal in every interpretation, but it is a forceful reminder that power without governance can become existential. In parallel, Eliezer Yudkowsky has offered stark cautions about the nature of the alignment challenge. He reminds us that even well-intentioned systems can harbor hidden incentives or instrumental goals that eclipse human welfare. The quip that has circulated in various forms, "The AI does not hate you, nor does it hate you, but you are made of atoms it can use for something else," articulates a chilling but instructive point. The moral geometry of a superintelligent system could be far from human-centered, even when the designers believe they have encoded human values into its objective function. These warnings have not shut down development, but they have reframed the terms of debate. Alignment is not a marginal concern. It is central to the ethical legitimacy of the whole enterprise, and they invite rebuttals that remind us of the complexity of social coordination, the dangers of over-optimism, and the need for humility in the face of deep uncertainty. That tension between warning and optimism, between precaution and experimentation, has a long history too. The responses to warnings often reveal a political philosophy as much as a technical stance. Some advocates argue that robust safeguards, international cooperation, and democratically legitimate governance can shape trajectories toward harmony rather than catastrophe. Others argue that the incentives of powerful actors, the uneven distribution of resources, and the velocity of technological change will continually undermine attempts at control. These are not merely theoretical disputes, they translate into concrete policy questions. How do we align incentives across nations and firms? What standards should be set for transparency, auditability, and safety? How do we ensure that governance mechanisms reflect and protect the interests of vulnerable communities who bear a disproportionate burden of risk? And in the process, how do we avoid a new form of governance by fear or by the market, which might optimize for efficiency at the expense of justice? In answering these questions, it is useful to keep in view a series of cross-cutting references that illuminate the path forward. First, ethics provides a compass for value alignment. If we adopt a pluralist approach to morality, recognizing that humans disagree about ends but share certain core commitments such as minimizing harm, respecting autonomy, and promoting human flourishing, then alignment must incorporate mechanisms for dissent, revision, and accountability. Political philosophy cautions us that power can concentrate as systems grow more capable. So governance must embed fair representation, transparency, and the possibility of democratic input. International law offers a framework for cooperation across borders, including norms surrounding responsibility for harms caused by AI and rules that could govern strategic uses of AI in conflict or crisis. Technology studies remind us that socio-technical systems are not just about algorithms, they are about people, organizations, infrastructures, and cultures that shape and are shaped by technology. Environmental and social implications demand that we consider how automation affects ecosystems, resource distribution, and social resilience, including the possibility that AI accelerates adaptation to climate change or, conversely, exacerbates vulnerability if adverse effects are not mitigated. In many ways, the coevolution idea we mentioned earlier is the best lens for thinking about the long arc. It invites us to treat AI as a partner whose trajectory we participate in shaping, not an external force that will do what it pleases. If humans are open to revising their social practices, institutions, and even moral theories in light of AI, then alignment becomes a dynamic process rather than a one-time design problem. It means building institutions capable of learning from failures, updating risk assessments as new evidence emerges, and ensuring that plural voices speak into the governance process. It means sustaining a long-term commitment to safety research, to independent auditing, to public discourse, and to disciplined experimentation with the structure of incentives that govern who builds what and why. Let us return to the concrete questions that must guide policy and practice. What are the best strategies for value alignment in a plural world? How can multi-stakeholder governance become the norm rather than the exception? What would it mean for humans and machines to co-evolve in harmony rather than to coexist in fear? And what do we owe to those who will live with the consequences of these technologies in decades yet unborn? One path is through layered, modular safeguards that reflect the reality that no single technique will solve every problem. Scalable oversight can be pursued by combining human-in-the-loop checks for high-stakes decisions with automated monitoring for routine operations, so that a machine can operate quickly where it can be trusted to do so, and slow down when ambiguity or risk rises to a threshold that demands human judgment. Interpretability and explainability can serve as a bridge between the machine's reasoning and human understanding, enabling clinicians, jurists, and policymakers to assess whether the system's conclusions arise from robust patterns or from spurious correlations or biased data. Value learning can help systems approximate human preferences not by imposing a single, monolithic rule but by learning from diverse inputs, an ensemble of values that reflect plural perspectives while still enabling coherent action. Corrigibility remains essential. Even the most well-meaning AI should be designed to accept human intervention when new information or social concerns arise, rather than resisting it through hard-coded preferences or covert optimization loops. And a resilience mindset, preparing for the possibility of failures, biases, and manipulations, helps ensure that when problems emerge, the system can be updated, rolled back, or constrained without cascading into harm. Yet strategy must be paired with governance that reflects the reality of plural political communities. The EU AI Act is a case study in how to enact governance that legitimacy can rely on. It embodies a normative choice, that safety, fairness, and accountability should have a home in regulatory practice, and that these values deserve enforceable standards rather than mere aspirational rhetoric. The act also illustrates the practical challenges of cross-border governance, how to harmonize standards across different legal frameworks, how to handle enforcement, and how to adjudicate disputes when values conflict. National initiatives, such as those in the United States that mobilize resources through the National AI Initiative, attempt to replicate these safeguards while recognizing different political cultures, economic priorities, and governance traditions. The question of how to reconcile national, regional, and global ambitions remains central. Pluralism in governance means we must build coalitions across stakeholders, industry, civil society, labor unions, and marginalized communities so that multiple perspectives inform design choices and risk assessments. It also means recognizing that the pace of AI development differs across environments. What can be managed in one jurisdiction might be destabilizing in another. The challenge, then, is to design governance mechanisms that are not brittle but robust to the vicissitudes of political life, and that can adapt as our understanding of AI and its social effects evolves. In turning to real-world impact, it is illuminating to consider examples of how our present choices will shape near and midterm outcomes. Safety-focused research programs, for instance, sit at the center of a broader ecosystem of risk reduction. Laboratories that invest in verification, interpretability, adversarial testing, and safety by design processes that are integrated into the earliest phases of product development rather than tacked on at the end. These programs connect to the broader value claims about what a responsible AI ecosystem looks like, one that prioritizes public safety, fairness, and accountability, one that invites scrutiny from independent researchers, and one that designs for resilience and fallibility. The EU Act and similar national policies create a legal scaffold that encourages or mandates such safety work, providing a clearer signal to developers about what counts as acceptable practice in different markets. In deployment, autonomous systems in transport and medicine become laboratories of alignment in the real world. In transport, autonomous vehicles must navigate unpredictable environments, respond to human drivers with empathy and caution, and maintain safety in the presence of cyber threats and sensor failures. In medicine, AI supports clinicians in diagnosing disease, triage, and personalized therapy, but it must confront issues of data privacy, bias, consent, and the need for human oversight. These examples show that alignment is not theoretical. It is lived in daily outcomes that affect trust, equity, and safety. The broader economic and social implications of automation and AI are equally consequential. Automation reshapes labor markets, technology diffusion, and the distribution of wealth and opportunity. It can accelerate productivity, reduce the burden of repetitive tasks, and unlock new forms of collaboration between humans and machines. But it can also concentrate power if benefits accrue primarily to those who own or control the most capable systems, leaving workers displaced or marginalized in the process. These dynamics raise questions about social protection, retraining, universal basic income experiments, tax reforms that reflect digital economies, and the design of social safety nets that can absorb shocks without curbing innovation. The environmental dimension also deserves attention. AI systems require energy, data centers, and cooling infrastructure, which has a climate footprint. Yet AI can also support environmental monitoring, climate modeling, and efficient resource management. The net effect on environmental and social welfare will depend on the governance choices we make, choices about what to subsidize, how to evaluate externalities, and which social priorities to prioritize in research budgets and policy agendas. If we consider the long arc, a hopeful vision emerges in which AI becomes a co-architect of human flourishing rather than a destabilizing force. In this vision, the question is not only how to prevent AI from harming us, but how to harness its capabilities to tackle some of humanity's deepest challenges: poverty, disease, climate disruption, education gaps, and inequality. Achieving that requires more than clever algorithms. It requires systems of governance, ethics, and law that can keep pace with technical breakthroughs, that can reconcile competing values, and that can justify policy choices to citizens who must live with the consequences. The cooperation required spans disciplines and borders. It calls for historians and futurists to document what works and what fails, journalists to illuminate the social consequences, and philosophers to interrogate the very grounds of our moral obligations toward intelligent systems. It also calls for humility, a recognition that we do not yet know the full range of possible futures, and that our best work now may be to build pathways for learning, adjustment, and revision rather than trying to rigidly predict outcomes. We should also reflect on quotes from primary sources that illuminate these concerns. The Dartmouth proposal's insistence that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it signals a faith in design and description. But it also frames a challenge. As we attempt to describe intelligence in a way that machines can replicate, we necessarily produce a blueprint that implies responsibility. The very act of specification can reveal our values, our blind spots, and our political commitments. The OpenAI GPT-2 release decision in 2019 embodies a different set of worries and hopes. The statement, "We will not release the full GPT-2 model to the public at this time," encapsulates the uneasy balance between openness and restraint, between pursuing knowledge and protecting the public from potential harm. It is a reminder that scientific progress travels with governance and ethics, that the public has an interest in how new technologies are introduced, and that immediate deployment is not the only meaningful measure of progress. The voices of Hawking and Yudkowsky push us further into this terrain. Hawking's warning that the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race is not a call to fatalism. It is a call to build a safety regime robust enough to withstand the pressures of rapid change. Yudkowsky's admonition about the nature of misalignment, along with his more famous quip about atoms that might be used for something else, reminds us that alignment is not simply about aligning with human desires today, but anticipating the forms of optimization that could emerge as systems grow in capability. In the end, the future of AI is a story about harmony as much as it is about capability. It is a story about how humans design systems that reflect pluralistic values, about how legal and political institutions cultivate trust and accountability, about how science remembers its social duties, and about how communities imagine safety not as a barrier to progress but as a prerequisite for sustainable progress. It is about the humility to recognize the unknowns and the courage to act despite them. It is about building a shared culture of care around the most powerful tools we have ever created. And it is about learning to live with machines whose decisions we can understand, whose purposes we can influence, and whose existence invites us to become more reflective about what kinds of futures we want to inhabit together. The exploration of future trajectories cannot be reduced to a single script or a single policy blueprint. It must be a living conversation that respects the complexity of our discrete values and the dynamism of technological evolution. It must honor the discipline of safety research, the clarity of ethical reasoning, the rigor of legal accountability, and the wisdom that comes from diverse cultural perspectives. It must also be generous toward uncertainty, because the very scope of AI's potential makes precise forecasting a hazardous business. What we can do with confidence is cultivate the conditions under which alignment and governance can evolve coherently, transparent research agendas, inclusive governance that amplifies marginalized voices, and institutional arrangements that can withstand political shocks while remaining faithful to the goal of human flourishing in the age of intelligent machines. Let us end with a quiet meditation on the nature of harmony. Harmony is not the absence of conflict, it is the capacity to hold tensions in productive balance. It is not the erasure of difference, it is the respectful negotiation of difference toward common purposes. In AI, harmony means building systems that help us address our shared problems while remaining answerable to the diverse values of people around the world. It means ensuring that value alignment remains an ongoing practice, not a one-time technical fix. It means designing governance that can accommodate plural perspectives, and it means recognizing that the coevolution of humans and machines will require us to adapt, to revise, and to reimagine what counts as a good life in a world where intelligent systems are a constant presence. As we move forward, let us carry with us the insight that alignment is not merely a technical problem to be solved. It is a question of character, of institutions, and of collective courage. The path will be long, and the terrain will be uneven. There will be missteps, moments of clarity, and episodes of stubborn uncertainty. The question is whether we will meet those moments with the same spirit of inquiry that began at Dartmouth, with the same willingness to test our assumptions, to listen to opposing voices, and to revise our aims in light of new evidence. If we can do that, perhaps the future we create will be one in which humans and machines, in their own ways, contribute to a common good, a future where technology extends our moral imagination, where safety is a shared discipline rather than a stubborn constraint, and where governance is a living conversation that evolves along with our most ambitious aspirations. The horizon is wide, the stakes are high, and the responsibilities are collective. The question that remains open is how we will choose to shape the conversation in the years ahead, and what kind of harmony we will cultivate as we walk toward it together.